Hey guys, tonight we are travelling back around 50,000 years to the freezing, unforgiving heart of the Pleistocene epoch, where the wind cuts like a freshly napped flint blade and the local wildlife views you mostly as a slow-moving snack. You are stepping into a blindingly white landscape, frost clinging to your eyelashes, the crisp, icy air stinging your lungs with every breath. You're about to prepare a surprisingly gourmet mammoth stew, though, let's be honest, given your modern lack of survival skills, you probably won't survive this little culinary expedition past the appetizer course. But we can pretend, right? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey. You pull the heavy, uncured animal hide tighter around your shoulders. It smells strongly of damp earth, old musk and wood smoke, a scent that your modern nose finds slightly alarming at first, but here it is the unmistakable perfume of survival. The snow beneath your thick, fur-wrapped boots crunches with a satisfying, rhythmic squeak. This is Eurasia, right in the thick of the last ice age. Forget your insulated down jackets, your electric blankets, and your heated car seats. Out here, warmth is a luxury earned through friction, constant movement, and sheer stubbornness. You adjust the rough fur collar around your neck, wishing you had a nice, thick wool scarf. The Neanderthals walking alongside you, however, seem completely unfazed by the chill. Their clothing is masterfully stitched together, using animal sinew and bone needles, creating a windproof. You have to admire their tailoring skills. There is no fast fashion out here, only slow, meticulous, life-saving gear. You are walking with a small, close-knit band of these ancient cousins of ours. They are shorter than you might expect perhaps, but built like absolute tanks. They are broad-chested, thick-boned, and radiate a kind of intense, quiet competence. Mainstream history tells us that Neanderthals were perfectly adapted to this brutal cold. Their stout frames and shorter limbs conserving body heat far better than our lanky, modern Homo sapiens skeletons ever could. You watch one of them, a man with a heavy brow ridge and a surprisingly gentle expression, meticulously picking at his teeth with a small, sharply carved twig. It is a quirky little fringe tidbit of archaeology that microscopic groove marks on fossilized Neanderthal teeth suggest they regularly used rudimentary toothpicks. Even in the dark depths of the Ice Age, dental hygiene was apparently a priority, which is honestly more than can be said for some of my former college roommates. The wind howls through a stand of skeletal birch trees to your left, their leafless branches rattling together like dry bones. You step carefully, mimicking the wide gait of your companions, avoiding hidden crevices beneath the blinding powder. Your mission tonight isn't just to survive another freezing evening, it is to cook, and not just to haphazardly roast a chunk of mysterious meat on a stick until it's charred black on the outside and dangerously, violently rare on the inside. No, we are aiming for something that would make a prehistoric Michelin inspector weep with joy. We are making a stew, but a proper stew requires a pot, liquid water, sustained heat, and a ridiculous amount of calories. Historians still argue whether Neanderthals routinely boiled their food or relied entirely on open flame roasting, but recent discoveries of complex hearths and specific wear patterns on stone tools suggest a level of culinary sophistication that goes way beyond simply throwing raw meat into a fire. You like to think they appreciated a good slow-cooked, deeply savoury broth just as much as we do on a dark winter night. You trudge further into a shallow, sweeping valley. The sky above is a pale, bruised purple, heavy with the promise of more snow later tonight. The sheer scale of the silence out here is deafening. There are no distant highways humming with traffic, no airplane engines cutting through the clouds, no ambient buzz of electricity. There is just the wind, the sound of your own heavy breathing, and the occasional sharp crack of a frozen branch snapping in the distance. It is incredibly peaceful, assuming you can successfully ignore the fact that a massive cave lion or a saber-toothed cat could easily be watching you from the rocky ridge above. Just a minor detail, Don't worry about it. Keep walking. Your guide points a thick leather-clad finger toward a frozen stream winding its way through the bottom of the valley floor. Water is the very first ingredient. You might think getting water in a world literally covered in frozen ice and snow would be the absolute easiest task of the day. But eating snow directly lowers your core body temperature drastically, which is a fantastic way to induce hypothermia and end your culinary adventure before you even prep the vegetables. You need liquid water, or at least solid ice chunks, that you can melt efficiently without wasting precious body heat to do so. You kneel by the edge of the frozen stream. The ice is incredibly thick, cloudy, with trapped air bubbles and little fragments of ancient frozen moss. Using a heavy, naturally rounded river stone you picked up along the way, you begin to bash at the surface. It takes significant effort. Your breath plumes in the freezing air, turning to white frost on the rough fur of your collar. Smack, smack, smack. The rhythm is jarring at first, then almost hypnotic. Slowly, a spiderweb fissure forms in the ice. You chip away at it, your arm muscles burning, until you expose the dark, incredibly fast-moving water beneath. It looks impossibly, bone-chillingly cold. You dip a makeshift leather pouch, a tightly stitched, waterproofed bladder from some unfortunate prey animal, into the freezing current. It fills with a heavy, satisfying slosh, carrying the water back toward the rocky overhang that serves as your tribe's temporary camp. You realize just how incredibly heavy a few gallons of liquid truly is. You miss indoor plumbing. You miss it with a burning, passionate intensity. The simple twist of a shiny metal faucet feels like unimaginable magic right now. But as your shoulders ache and your fingers tingle, there is a certain grounded, primal satisfaction in this physical labor. You are earning your dinner in a way that tapping an app for food delivery will never, ever replicate. Back at the camp, located under the shelter of a massive, sweeping limestone outcropping, the rest of the group is busy. The floor of this natural rock shelter is littered with the debris of daily Ice Age life. Piles of sharp flint flakes from tool making, scattered, marrow-sucked bones, and bundles of dried brownish grasses. The air here is slightly stiller, physically blocked from the worst of the biting wind by the curve of the stone. It feels like a sanctuary. Before the main course can even be conceptually considered, you need to gather the base aromatics. Yes, aromatics. You didn't think it was just going to be boiled mammoth chunks and nothing else, did you? While the men begin preparing and repairing the heavy hunting spears, a couple of the older women in the tribe motion for you to follow them along the sheltered, sun-facing base of the cliff. Here, where the snow is slightly thinner and the dark rock face holds onto a tiny, residual fraction of the sun's weak daytime warmth, hardy Ice Age flora clings desperately to life. You brush aside a layer of powdery snow to reveal a patch of stubborn, low-lying greenery. It looks like a scraggly, unloved cousin of modern wild mustard. You pinch a tiny leaf and rub it between your freezing, stiff fingers. A sharp, delightfully peppery scent rises in the air, piercing right through the cold, flat smell of the snow. It is not exactly a fully stocked supermarket spice aisle, but in this desolate, frozen landscape, it is an absolute culinary goldmine. You carefully pluck the leaves, storing them in a small hide pouch tied at your waist. Next to the mustard greens, you find some gnarly, fibrous roots poking out of the frozen topsoil. They look entirely unappetizing, resembling twisted pieces of driftwood more than actual food. But your companions dig them up eagerly with specialized flattened bone tools, nodding with approval. When boiled continuously for a few hours, these tough, starchy tubers will break down, thickening the watery broth and providing essential, life-sustaining carbohydrates. Digging them out with a sharp piece of flint you borrowed, your knuckles scrape against the rock-hard earth. It is tough, callousing work. You wonder briefly if these ancient, stubborn plants are the distant ancestors of the pristine, washed carrots sitting comfortably in your crisper drawer back home. Probably not. These roots are tough, bitter survivors, much like the people who rely on them. You toss a particularly knobbly root into your pouch. If you were back in the 21st century, you would probably pay $30 for a tiny plate of this heritage foraged root at some trendy farm-to-table restaurant in Brooklyn. Here, it is just Tuesday's dinner. You spend the next hour slowly moving along the rock face, engaging in a quiet, meditative scavenger hunt. Your fingers are completely numb, and your toes feel like blocks of solid ice inside your boots. But the rhythmic, repetitive motion of searching, brushing away snow, and plucking leaves is strangely, profoundly soothing. It is a mindless, focused task that allows your thoughts to drift. You imagine the immense mile-high glaciers covering half the continent just to the north, the slow, grinding, unstoppable creep of ice shaping the mountains and valleys over slow millennia. You're a tiny, fragile, entirely insignificant speck in this massive frozen world, yet here you are, meticulously planning a dinner party. The pale light begins to fail, the purple sky shifting into a deep, bruised, velvety indigo. The temperature plummets as the shadows lengthen. It is time to head back to the safety of the overhang. Your waist pouch is slightly heavier now, filled with a modest but hard-earned handful of bitter greens, starchy tubers, and some wild pine needles that will add a beautiful, resinous, earthy depth to the cooking water. As you walk back, you pause and look out over the vast, darkening tundra. The landscape is a minimalist canvas of whites, greys, and deep, encroaching blues. In the far, hazy distance, you see massive, dark shapes moving incredibly slowly against the snow line. The sheer scale of them is hard to comprehend from this distance, but even miles away, they project a sense of immense, ancient, unstoppable power. They are your target, they are the main ingredient. But taking down one of those mountains of muscle and fur is a monumental task for tomorrow. Tonight is strictly about preparation. Tonight is about setting the stage for the feast to come. You return to the rock shelter, ducking out of the cutting wind. The vast, empty silence of the tundra is immediately replaced by the low, comforting murmurs of your companions, the soft rustle of dry hides, and the sharp, rhythmic clack-clack-clack of two stones striking each other in the gloom. The prehistoric kitchen is officially open. The very first ingredients are starting to assemble, but a kitchen is absolutely nothing without a hearth. As you set down your heavy, sloshing water pouch and your meagre handful of ancient, frostbitten herbs, you realise the next crucial step is about to begin. The bone-deep cold is seeping into your very marrow, and without heat there will be no stew, and more importantly, there will be no you. The freezing Pleistocene landscape has offered up its first tiny, hidden treasures, but the real work and the real warmth is yet to come. You set down that heavy water bladder near the back of the rock shelter, flexing your stiff fingers to restore blood flow. You proudly present your small leather pouch of bitter greens and knobbly roots to the older women of the tribe, fully expecting a prehistoric gold star for your efforts. Instead, one of them, a woman with deep laugh lines around her eyes and a necklace of polished cave bear teeth, chuckles softly and gestures back out toward the fading light. Apparently, your meagre handful is barely enough to garnish a single bowl of broth, let alone feed an entire hungry clan of Ice Age hunters. So, with a deep, slightly dramatic sigh that gets immediately snatched away by the wind, you pull your heavy fur collar back up over your ears. The delicate art of ancient foraging is far from over, and you are going back out into the frost. This time, you follow a younger member of the group, someone who moves with a fluid, silent grace that makes your own clumsy, snow-crunching footsteps feel incredibly loud and awkward. You are learning to read the subtle language of the snowpack. Foraging here isn't about wandering aimlessly until you spot something green. It is a highly analytical process of geometry and memory. Your guide points out a slight, unnatural dip in the smooth surface of a snowdrift, a tiny depression indicating a buried shrub is radiating just enough residual heat from the earth to melt the snow immediately around its dormant branches. You drop to your knees, the cold seeping instantly through your thick leggings, and begin to dig with your bare, calloused hands. Beneath a foot of powdery, crystalline snow, you uncover a treasure trove of dried, pale, papery blossoms, still clinging to a brittle stem. They smell faintly sweet, a stark contrast to the sharp, peppery mustard greens you found earlier. You are looking at ancient ancestors of yarrow and chamomile. It is a quirky little fringe tidbit of archaeology that scientists have actually found microscopic traces of these specific, bitter-tasting medicinal plants trapped inside fossilized Neanderthal dental plaque. It proves they weren't just eating whatever they could find for sheer calories. They understood flavor, and they likely understood natural medicine, actively seeking out specific herbs to soothe an upset stomach or flavor a meal. Your local artisan cafe charges $7 for a hot chamomile infusion, while out here in the Pleistocene, it is completely free, provided you are willing to risk mild frostbite and the occasional saber-tooth encounter to harvest it. You carefully snap the brittle stems, letting the tiny, aromatic flower heads fall into your pouch. There is the sharp, dry snap of the frozen wood, the soft, whispering shh of the snow being brushed away, and the incredibly earthy, deep smell of dormant soil that briefly wafts up before the freezing air neutralizes it. It is a slow, methodical rhythm. Brush, snap, gather. Brush, snap, gather. Historians still argue whether these ancient human populations actively manage these wild patches, perhaps deliberately clearing competing brush in the warmer months to encourage the growth of these specific herbs, or if they simply possessed a flawless, encyclopedic memory of the landscape, returning to the exact same hidden crevices year after year. Either way, their connection to this seemingly barren frozen dirt is profound and intimate. You move further down the ridgeline, the rock shelter, now just a dark, comforting shadow in the distance. The mainstream historical consensus is that this vast ecosystem, the Mammoth Steppe, was not a useless frozen wasteland, but a highly productive grassland. Beneath this blanket of winter snow lies a dense mat of nutritious grasses, herbs, and dwarf sedges. It is this specific, nutrient-rich vegetation that allowed the region to support such a staggering population of massive herbivores. You are literally standing on top of the greatest salad bar in prehistoric history. You just have to know exactly how to unearth it. You use a sturdy piece of carved antler to pry up the frozen earth, unearthing a cluster of tiny, pungent wild bulbs that look remarkably like miniature onions. The sharp, savoury smell makes your stomach rumble loudly, a sound that gets completely swallowed by the vast, empty silence of the tundra. And then, the silence is broken. Not by a loud roar, but by a low, deep, rhythmic vibration that you feel in the soles of your fur-wrapped boots before you actually hear it in your ears. Thump, crunch, thump, crunch. It is the sound of something incredibly heavy, displacing a massive amount of snow with every single step. Your guide freezes instantly, dropping into a low crouch behind a snow-draped boulder. You immediately do the same, your heart suddenly hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against your ribs. The air feels suddenly thicker, charged with a sudden sharp spike of primal adrenaline. You hold your breath, peering cautiously over the icy edge of the rock. Emerging from the swirling purple twilight is a creature straight out of a heavy metal album cover. It is a woolly rhinoceros, the magnificent Coelodonta. It is roughly the size of a modern white rhino, but covered head to toe in a thick, shaggy coat of reddish-brown hair that hangs in thick cords around its massive, stocky legs. But the most striking feature is its horn. Unlike modern rhinos, this beast possesses a staggering, flattened front horn, nearly a metre long, sweeping upward in a graceful, deadly curve. You watch in absolute silent awe as the colossal animal lowers its heavy, armoured head and uses that incredible, flattened horn like a giant snowplow, sweeping it side to side to clear away the deep powder and expose the dormant grasses beneath. The sheer physical power on display is staggering. You realise with crystal clarity that your premium health insurance does not cover prehistoric rhino trampling, pressing your body flat against the freezing rock. The woolly rhino lets out a low, rumbling huff that sends a massive cloud of steam into the freezing air. It continues its slow, rhythmic ploughing, entirely oblivious to the two tiny, fragile hominids cowering behind a rock just 50 yards away. The ambient sound of the moment is surreal. The heavy, muffled thud of its massive footpads, the loud, abrasive scrape of its keratin horn against the hidden permafrost, and the deep, wet sound of its heavy jaws tearing up thick handfuls of frozen grass. You wait in breathless silence for what feels like an eternity, watching the giant shadow slowly drift past you and disappear back into the swirling, darkening mists of the valley. Once the heavy vibrations finally fade completely from the earth, you let out a long, shaky breath that plumes white in the dark air. Your guide gives you a quick, reassuring nod, completely unbothered by the encounter. For them, avoiding walking tanks is just a standard part of running errands. You carefully stand up, your knees slightly weak, the adrenaline slowly leaving your system and making the cold feel even sharper than before. You decide that you have absolutely pushed your luck enough for one evening. You quickly gather a final prize, a small cluster of wrinkled, dark blue berries clinging stubbornly to a low juniper bush, their resinous, piney scent promising a complex depth of flavour for the upcoming meal. Securing the pouch at your waist, you let out a soft, nervous chuckle. You realise this evening, forage is vastly more stressful than accidentally forgetting your reusable canvas tote bag at the local organic grocery store. There are no clearly marked aisles here, no bright fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and definitely no friendly cashiers asking if you found everything okay. There is only the harsh, beautiful reality of the food chain, and you're intimately, uncomfortably aware of your precarious position right in the middle of it. But your pouch is now pleasingly full. You have bitter greens, sweet chamomile, sharp wild onions, and resinous juniper berries. You have the complex, carefully curated flavour profile of a prehistoric masterpiece ready to be unleashed. The light has almost completely vanished now, the sky turning a deep, impenetrable obsidian dotted with the first few piercingly bright, icy stars. The wind picks up, biting viciously at any exposed skin, reminding you that lingering out here in the dark is a fatal mistake. You turn back toward the direction of the camp, tracing your own half-buried footprints back through the snow. The heavy, quiet walk back to the rock shelter is a journey of freezing, quiet anticipation. Every single step brings you closer to safety, the snow squeaking rhythmically beneath your heavy boots. You survived the wandering megafauna, you mastered the frost, and you gathered the herbs. But as you finally see the faint, warm, flickering orange glow reflecting off the limestone cliffs ahead, you realise that the most crucial, magical element of the entire Ice Age kitchen is waiting for you. The ingredients are ready, but the hearth is still cold. You step beneath the massive, overarching lip of the limestone cave, your thick fur boots leaving the deep, squeaking snow behind for the solid, dry, packed earth of the shelter floor. The biting wind drops immediately, no longer howling aggressively in your ears but reduced to a low, distant, mournful moan sweeping across the valley behind you. You loosen your heavy collar slightly, letting out a long, foggy exhale that slowly dissipates in the dim light. The older members of the clan are tending to a much larger, communal blaze deeper inside the cavern, but for your specific culinary masterpiece tonight, you need your own dedicated cooking hearth closer to the cave mouth for proper ventilation. Right now, your designated kitchen is just a quiet ring of blackened, soot-stained river stones, holding nothing but cold, grey, lifeless ash. You drop your precious pouch of foraged herbs next to the heavy, sloshing water bladder. It is time to summon the most critical element of human survival. You are going to make fire. And because you inevitably left your trusty plastic gas station lighter in your other pair of mammoth hide pants, you have to do this the hard, ancient way. You sit cross-legged on the dusty cave floor, pulling a small, incredibly soft leather pouch from your woven belt. Inside are your fire-making tools, carefully curated and highly prized by anyone living in a frozen world. You pull out a sharp, grey piece of flint, its edges napped to fit perfectly in your palm, and a heavy, metallic-looking nodule. This is iron pyrite, also known as fool's gold. Mainstream history tells us that this specific, ingenious combination, Flint and iron pyrite was the standard prehistoric fire-starting kit across Ice Age Europe. When you forcefully strike the hard flint against the pyrite, the violent friction tears off tiny, microscopic particles of the iron and sulfur compound. These particles immediately oxidize in the oxygen-rich air, creating a shower of brilliant sparks that burn at over 1,000 degrees. It is ancient, brilliant, portable chemistry happening right in the palm of your freezing, trembling hands. But sparks alone do not make a warm hearth. You need something very specific to catch them. You reach into another pouch and pull out a handful of true tinder. This isn't just dry grass you picked up off the ground. It is the spongy, highly fibrous inside of a hoof fungus, carefully harvested from the bark of a dead, rotting birch tree and meticulously dried for weeks. It feels exactly like soft, ancient felt. You tear off a small, delicate piece, fluffing it up gently with your thumbs to maximize the surface area, and place it carefully on a flat, dry stone in the center of the ash ring. Now comes the part where you aggressively humble yourself. You hold the tinder and the flint firmly in your left hand and the heavy pyrite nodule in your right. You strike them together. Clack. Nothing happens. You strike again, slightly harder. Clack. A pathetic, dull scraping sound echoes softly off the cave walls. You strike a third time and clumsily smash the rough pyrite directly into your own icy, stiff knuckles. A sharp jolt of pain shoots up your arm, a gentle reminder that being a prehistoric apex predator takes a surprising amount of manual dexterity. If this were a modern kitchen, you would be angrily clicking the broken piezoelectric igniter on your gas stove, muttering to yourself about calling the landlord. Here, the landlord is a massive continent-spanning glacier, and it absolutely does not care if you eat hard raw roots tonight. You take a deep, slow breath, steadying your shaking hands. The trick, you remember, is not brute downward force, but a sharp, glancing blow, exactly like skipping a flat stone across the surface of a frozen pond. You adjust your grip, angle the flint perfectly, and strike again. Swing! A brilliant, incredibly bright orange spark leaps from the grey stone, leaving a tiny glowing sulphurous trail in the dim air, and lands squarely in the centre of the fluffed fungus. You freeze, holding your breath, watching it intently. For a terrifying silent second, absolutely nothing happens. Then a microscopic ring of black char begins to form on the fuzzy brown surface, followed by a thin, almost invisible, beautiful wisp of pale white smoke. It caught, the ember is alive. Now you must feed it before it dies. You carefully pick up the glowing, incredibly fragile ember and transfer it into the centre of a much larger bundle of dry, stringy cedar bark and incredibly fine meadow grasses you gathered days ago. This bundle looks exactly like a messy, oversized bird's nest. You cup it gently in both hands, bringing it intimately close to your face. The smoke smells sharp, woodsy, and intensely, beautifully ancient. You begin to blow. You start with a long, slow, steady stream of air from your lips, gently feeding pure oxygen into the tiny, glowing red heart of the nest. The ember brightens immediately, expanding from a tiny pinprick to a hot, angry, glowing coin of orange light. The smoke thickens instantly, immediately stinging your eyes and causing them to water profusely. You cough softly, adjusting your angle, but as anyone who has ever sat around a campfire knows, the smoke possesses a magical, malicious sentience and will stubbornly follow your face no matter which direction you lean. You keep blowing, your cheeks puffing out, getting slightly lightheaded from the deep breaths. You are blowing so hard you are half worried you might pass out and faceplant directly into your own prehistoric kitchen, which would certainly ruin the carefully cultivated, relaxed ambience of the evening. As the heat begins to comfortably sting your raw palms, you grab a tiny pinch of black powder from a small shell container resting on the stones and carefully sprinkle it directly into the smoking bundle. This is a quirky little fringe tidbit of archaeology. Traces of a specific mineral called manganese dioxide have been consistently found at numerous Neanderthal hearth sites. This black powder significantly lowers the combustion temperature of wood, essentially acting as a highly effective Ice Age lighter fluid. It is a stunning display of chemical engineering by people who are often unfairly depicted as simple-minded, bumbling brutes. It is also vastly superior to that foul-smelling, highly combustible chemical fluid your uncle liberally uses to douse the backyard barbecue every single summer. Historians still argue whether Neanderthals could create fire entirely at will from scratch using these methods, or if they primarily relied on preserving embers from natural lightning strikes and carrying them from camp to camp in special hollowed-out horns. But sitting here, watching the intense chemical reaction you just sparked with your own hands, you feel pretty confident in their and your impressive pyrotechnic abilities. With one final deep concentrated breath, the thick white smoke suddenly ignites. Poof! A beautiful, dancing, vibrant yellow flame bursts outward from the centre of the dry bird's nest. The sudden bright light casts long, leaping, dynamic shadows against the rough limestone walls of the cave, making the jagged stalactites hanging far above look like giant, shifting teeth in the firelight. The sudden magical appearance of the flame feels like a minor, personal miracle. You quickly and carefully lower the burning bundle into the exact centre of your stone ring, hastily but deliberately piling on handfuls of pencil-thin twigs of completely dry, dead spruce. The flames lick hungrily at the new fuel, snapping and popping with a sharp, incredibly satisfying rhythmic cadence. The sound, crackle, snap, hiss, pop, is the oldest, most deeply ingrained ASMR in human history. It is the universal sound of safety. It is the sound of home. You carefully begin to feed the fire, slowly building its structure to last. You add thicker and thicker branches, purposefully creating a crisscrossing lattice of sturdy wood that allows the air to flow freely from beneath the coals. The heat begins to radiate outward, a physical, tangible, beautiful force, aggressively pushing back the oppressive, creeping, bone-deep chill of the Ice Age night. You hold your freezing, stiff, bruised hands out toward the dancing flames, feeling the glorious, slightly stinging sensation of your constricted blood vessels finally dilating. The warmth sinks deep into your pale skin, thawing your knuckles, travelling slowly up your heavy arms and settling deeply into your chest. The involuntary shivering that had become a constant, subconscious background vibration in your exhausted muscles finally, blissfully begins to subside. As the fire grows into a robust, sturdy, crackling blaze, the entire atmosphere of your little designated kitchen corner transforms completely. The harsh, pale, freezing blues and greys of the frozen twilight outside the cave mouth are entirely replaced by warm, vibrant, shifting hues of brilliant orange, soft gold, and deep, glowing red. The rich, calming scent of the burning spruce resin completely fills the air, mingling pleasantly with the earthy, damp smell of your heavy fur clothing slowly drying out in the heat. You carefully arrange the heaviest, most solid oak logs around the outer perimeter of the fire, purposefully creating a glowing, superheated central core of deep red embers. That specific core will eventually provide the sustained, perfectly even heat necessary for the slow cooking to come. You watch the flames dance, completely mesmerized, effortlessly entering that quiet, deeply peaceful, trance-like state that all human beings fall into when staring softly into a campfire. The fire is now beautifully established, its warm, glowing heart beating steadily and defiantly against the freezing, encroaching dark. You take a slow moment to look around the cave shelter, now richly illuminated by this new flickering light. The rough, uneven walls are alive with the gentle movements of your newly created hearth. You have successfully carved out a tiny, glowing, warm sanctuary of absolute civilization right on the very edge of the brutal, unforgiving tundra. The wind outside seems to howl just a little louder now, as if deeply frustrated that it can no longer reach you here in your safe pocket of warmth. The kitchen is perfectly set. Now the real cooking can begin. You are sitting cross-legged in the dust, the glorious radiating heat of your newly built hearth successfully pushing back the creeping, bone-deep chill of the Pleistocene night. The flames are snapping happily, feeding on the dry spruce twigs you carefully arranged just a few moments ago. You stretch your legs out, feeling the heavy fur of your boots start to warm up, a deeply comforting sensation that makes your eyelids suddenly feel incredibly heavy. You could easily just curl up right here on the soft, dry earth of the cave floor and drift off to sleep to the rhythmic, hypnotic crackle and pop of the burning wood. But your stomach gives a loud, unceremonious grumble, echoing softly in the cavern. You have a handful of bitter mustard greens, a pouch of wild chamomile, some incredibly tough starchy roots, and a heavy bladder full of freezing, slushy river water. What you do not have, you suddenly realise with a sinking feeling, is a pot. You look around the dimly lit cave, half expecting to see a heavy, cast-iron Dutch oven tucked away in a corner, or at least a large fired clay vessel sitting elegantly by the fire. But there is nothing. Not a single piece of pottery exists yet in this frozen era. The invention of fired ceramics is still tens of thousands of years away in humanity's future. You cannot simply pull a stainless steel saucepan from a cabinet, and frankly, given your modern track record with the Tupperware drawer of doom, you'd probably spend 20 minutes just looking for the matching lid anyway. Here in the Stone Age, culinary hardware is an entirely different, highly improvised game. A mainstream historical fact that often gets completely overlooked is that the Stone Age is actually a massively misleading name, born entirely out of preservation bias. We call it that simply because stone tools, flint hand axes, and rock scrapers are the only things hard enough to survive being buried in the damp, acidic earth for 50,000 years. But in reality, you and your Neanderthal companions are living squarely in the Wood Age. Wood, bark, animal hides, and woven plant fibres make up the vast, overwhelming majority of your daily tools and infrastructure. But these organic materials simply rot away into nothingness over the millennia, leaving modern archaeologists with a highly skewed, rock-heavy view of the ancient world. You are surrounded by masterful, complex woodwork that history will completely forget. The older woman with the cave bear-tooth necklace notices your slight confusion as you stare blankly from the heavy water bladder to the crackling fire. She chuckles a low, rumbling sound in her chest and walks over to the shadowed perimeter of the cave. When she returns, she is carrying a massive, incredibly heavy, dark object, cradling it against her chest like a sleeping toddler. She sets it down on the dirt floor right in front of you with a dull, heavy thud. You lean in closer, the dancing orange firelight revealing the ultimate piece of Ice Age cookware. It is a gigantic, hollowed-out piece of dense pine wood. You run your bare, slightly calloused fingers along the thick, uneven rim of the vessel. The outside still bears the rough, textured, deeply grooved bark of the original tree, feeling incredibly coarse and sturdy beneath your touch. But the inside is a totally different story. The interior basin is remarkably smooth, carefully scraped and gouged out to form a deep, generous bowl, capable of holding a couple of gallons of liquid. You can actually feel the shallow, scalloped tool marks running along the inside grain, a tactile, braille-like record of the hours of patient, rhythmic labour it took to hollow this out, using nothing but sharpened pieces of flint and bone chisels. It is a beautiful, deeply functional, completely rustic piece of artisanal kitchenware that a modern hipster gastropub would probably charge you an arm and a leg just to look at. Historians still argue whether early human populations frequently spent days meticulously chopping down healthy trees to carve these deep, symmetrical wooden bowls from scratch, or if they primarily utilised naturally hollowed out tree burls and large, rotting stump cavities, just modifying them slightly there with their stone adzes for convenience. Looking at the beautiful, organic, slightly asymmetrical shape of the heavy wooden trough sitting right in front of you, it clearly looks like a massive burl that was scavenged from a fallen giant in the forest, its natural, bulbous curves perfectly suited to hold a large volume of heavy mammoth broth. But as you inspect the beautifully carved interior, you immediately spot a massive, seemingly fatal flaw. A long, jagged crack runs directly down the side of the wooden bowl, a natural split in the timber that looks more than wide enough to leak your precious, freezing river water all over the dusty floor. You sigh, assuming you are going to have to go back out into the freezing night to scavenge another massive tree tumour. But your Neanderthal companion simply smiles, reaching into a small hide pouch hanging off her woven belt. She pulls out a dark, sticky, hardened lump of black material and hands it to you. It feels slightly tacky to the touch, and it smells intensely of deep, resinous smoke, campfires, and old pine needles. This is a quirky little fringe tidbit of archaeology. You are holding a chunk of solid birch bark pitch, widely considered to be humanity's very first synthetic material. Neanderthals figured out that if you slowly heat the papery, white bark of a birch tree in a perfectly oxygen-starved environment, like a sealed, smouldering hole in the ground, it sweats out a thick, black, incredibly sticky tar. When this tar cools, it turns into an absolute rock-hard superglue. They used it to attach sharp flint spearheads to heavy wooden shafts, to waterproof their leather boots, and, right now, to fix a leaky soup pot. Honestly, it puts any modern, frustratingly complicated DIY, flat-pack furniture assembly directly to shame. You didn't even need an Allen wrench. The older woman gestures toward the fire. You take the dark lump of birch tar and hold it carefully near the glowing hot coals. Almost instantly, the edges of the black rock begin to soften, turning shiny and viscous. The rich, woodsy scent intensifies, filling the space between you and the hearth. Once the pitch is soft and pliable, exactly like warm modelling clay, she expertly presses it directly into the jagged crack of the wooden bowl, smoothing it down flat with a wet thumb. Within seconds, the ancient superglue hardens as it cools in the chilly cave air, creating a perfectly watertight, permanent seal. Your heavy wooden pot is suddenly, flawlessly complete. Now the logistics. You grab the heavy, tightly stitched animal bladder you filled at the frozen river earlier. It is heavy, cold, and slightly clammy to the touch. You carefully untie the sinew cord at the top and begin to pour the freezing, slushy water directly into your newly repaired wooden trough. The water hits the dry, scraped wood with a loud, hollow, satisfying splosh. You pour it all in, watching the waterline rise until the heavy bowl is roughly 3/4 full. Small, cloudy chunks of river ice bob gently on the dark surface, clinking softly against the wooden sides like tiny ancient wind chimes. You sit back on your heels and look from the water-filled wooden bowl to the roaring, superheated fire. A very obvious, very problematic physics dilemma finally dawns on you. If you place a completely wooden bowl directly onto a blazing 1,000-degree fire, you will not boil the water. You will simply burn a massive hole through the bottom of the bowl, immediately extinguish your precious fire with 2 gallons of freezing river water, and severely embarrass yourself in front of your highly competent Ice Age hosts. You have successfully acquired a pot, but you are still entirely missing the stove. The Neanderthal woman laughs again, clearly enjoying your modern, deeply confused hesitation. She points a thick finger, not at the fire, but toward a pile of large, smooth grey objects, stacked neatly near the edge of the hearth. You crawl over to the pile, the dust of the cave floor coating the knees of your heavy hide trousers. These are river stones. Specifically, they are large, smooth, naturally rounded cobbles of dense granite and basalt, each one roughly the size of a large, heavy grapefruit. You pick one up. It is incredibly dense, cold, and beautifully smooth, its surface polished over countless millennia by the relentless, rushing currents of the Ice Age rivers. You hold it in both hands, feeling its solid, comforting weight. These stones are the final brilliant secret to your ancient slow cooker. You are not going to put the wooden bowl on the fire. You are going to put the fire inside the wooden bowl. You carefully select 5 or 6 of the heaviest, most solid granite cobbles from the pile. You avoid anything that looks like porous sandstone, remembering a distant, hazy geology lesson that porous rocks might have tiny pockets of ancient water trapped inside them. If you heat a waterlogged rock in a roaring fire, the water turns to steam, The pressure builds, and the rock aggressively explodes like a prehistoric fragmentation grenade. You're trying to make dinner, not actively participate in a cave-dwelling demolition derby. Sticking to the dense, heavy granite is the smartest, safest culinary move of the evening. Using 2 thick, sturdy branches of green, unburnt oak as a pair of oversized, clumsy, makeshift tongs, you carefully roll the heavy river stones directly into the absolute hottest, deepest, glowing red center of your established campfire. You nestle them deeply among the white-hot coals, burying them so they can absorb the maximum amount of thermal energy. Now the hardest part of the entire cooking process begins: the waiting. You sit back, dusting the soot off your cold hands, and settle into the quiet rhythm of the cave. The fire crackles happily, a warm, shifting, orange entity pushing back the dark. The wind continues to howl outside, a distant, muffled roar that only serves to make the interior of the rock shelter feel incredibly safe and profoundly cozy. You watch the grey river stones slowly change colour deep within the flames. First, they become coated in a thick, matte black layer of wood soot. Then, slowly, agonizingly slowly, that soot burns away, and the actual surface of the granite begins to subtly change, taking on a dull, dangerous, deeply beautiful red glow. You're effectively creating the world's most dangerous, high-stakes, purely mechanical heating element. The prehistoric kitchen is fully prepped, the water is waiting, and your ancient slow cooker is finally powering up. You watch the granite stones pulse with that deep, dangerous red light deep inside the fire, your eyelids growing heavier and heavier with each passing minute. The rhythmic, hypnotic crackle of the dry spruce wood, and the absolute, radiating warmth of the hearth bouncing off your beautifully patched, birch tar-sealed wooden bowl lull you into a deeply comfortable, trance-like state. You pull the heavy animal hide tightly up to your chin, sinking down into the soft dust of the cave floor, and drift into a long, dreamless, incredibly peaceful sleep. When you finally open your eyes, the long, freezing Pleistocene night has quietly passed. The roaring fire has burned down to a gentle, smoky bed of grey ash and a few stubborn glowing orange coals. You stretch your stiff limbs, your muscles aching slightly from the hard earth. The kitchen is fully prepped, the hearth is established. But as you look at your beautifully crafted, empty wooden pot, reality sets in. A gourmet prehistoric stew requires actual, substantial protein. You rub the last remnants of sleep from your eyes and step out from the rock overhang into the blinding, crisp, diamond-bright light of an Ice Age dawn. The hunting party is already fully assembled, their breath pluming heavily in the freezing air like a line of small locomotive engines. You quickly grab a heavy, fire-hardened wooden spear with a perfectly napped, razor-sharp flint tip, mostly just to look the part, because let's be totally honest, your primary hunting strategy back home consists of lazily circling the grocery store parking lot 3 times just to find the closest spot to the automatic doors. You fall into line behind the seasoned, deeply focused hunters. The howling wind has completely died down overnight, leaving the vast, sweeping tundra buried under a fresh, pristine, untouched layer of sparkling white powder. The morning silence is profound, broken only by the synchronized squeaking crunch of your heavy, fur-wrapped boots hitting the fresh snow. You are heading out onto the Mammoth Steppe, a vast, frozen, endless grassland that stretches all the way to the pale horizon. It does not take very long to find the trail. In fact, calling it a trail feels entirely inadequate. It looks more like a small, rogue glacier decided to plough a deep, deliberate trench directly through the centre of the valley. You stop and stare down at a single footprint pressed incredibly deep into the frozen mud and snow. It is perfectly round and roughly the size of a very large, deep dish pizza pan. You could comfortably fit both of your heavy, fur-clad boots inside this single track and still have plenty of room left over around the edges. The sheer terrifying weight required to compress the hard earth This deeply is staggering to consider. The icy edges of the track are sharp and crisp, meaning the massive animal passed through here very recently. Your heart does a sudden nervous flutter against your ribs, a sharp reminder that you are no longer at the top of the food chain. You start tracking, moving in a low, cautious crouch to avoid breaking the skyline and alerting anything in the valley below. The trail weaves deliberately through a sparse, ghostly stand of skeletal, frost-covered larch trees. Here, you get a tangible, physical sense of what you're actually up against. A massive, thick branch, easily the thickness of your thigh, has been casually, violently snapped off a tree trunk, about 10 feet off the ground, simply because it was slightly in the way of the passing giant. You swallow hard, your mouth suddenly dry. A mainstream historical fact is that the woolly mammoth, Mammothus primigenius, was exquisitely, almost unfairly, adapted to this brutal environment. They were not just big, hairless elephants, accidentally caught in a winter storm. Beneath their incredibly thick skin, they possessed a solid, dense layer of insulating brown fat up to 4 inches thick, acting as a massive, walking, highly efficient thermal blanket that kept their core perfectly warm even in the middle of sub-zero blizzards. As you carefully step past the broken larch tree, your Neanderthal guide suddenly stops and points a thick finger at the jagged, splintered wood. Caught firmly on the rough bark is a thick, coarse tuft of animal hair, snatched entirely by accident from the beast as it brushed past. You reach out and rub it between your freezing fingers. It feels incredibly wiry, intensely oily, and completely water resistant, thanks to highly active sebaceous glands that constantly condition their massive coats to repel the melting snow. But what genuinely surprises you is the actual colour. It isn't just a décomptique, muddy, boring brown. It has a distinctly reddish, almost golden hue catching the morning sun. It is a quirky little fringe tidbit of archaeology that modern DNA analysis of perfectly preserved mammoth specimens found frozen in the Siberian permafrost has revealed that some of these massive animals were actually blonde or even strawberry blonde. It takes a tiny, microscopic bit of the terrifying edge off the monster to realise it was confidently rocking a prehistoric sun-kissed salon dye job, but really only a tiny bit. The massive tracks lead you relentlessly up a steep, rocky, snow-covered embankment. Your leg muscles burn with the intense, highly unfamiliar effort of climbing through knee-deep drifts, a sharp, painful reminder that your modern cardio routine of aggressively speed-walking to the kitchen fridge during television commercial breaks has not adequately prepared you for Ice Age survival. You finally reach the wind-swept crest of the ridge, dropping immediately to your stomach in the cold, powdery snow right beside the lead hunter. He gestures silently for you to peer slowly over the icy edge. You inch forward, your chin resting directly on the freezing frost, and look down into the wide, sweeping, incredibly peaceful bowl-shaped valley below. There they are, a small grazing herd of woolly mammoths, completely unaware of your presence, slowly moving through the deep drifts. You completely forget to breathe. The sheer, majestic scale of the animals is impossible to overstate. The largest female, the matriarch confidently leading the group, stands easily 10 feet tall at the shoulder, a towering, unstoppable mountain of muscle, fat and shaggy fur. Her sweeping, incredibly long ivory tusks curve dramatically outward and then tightly inward, intertwining slightly at the tips like a pair of massive, deadly parentheses. Every single time she exhales, a thick white, billowing cloud of steam erupts from her trunk, momentarily obscuring her dark, surprisingly intelligent eyes. Historians still argue whether Neanderthals routinely and actively hunted fully grown, entirely healthy adult mammoths using organised, close-quarters spear attacks, or if they primarily relied on scavenging dead carcasses, safely targeting only the sick, the very young, or those unfortunate enough to get permanently stuck in muddy sinkholes. When you look down at that walking fortress of ivory and muscle, the safe, opportunistic, scavenging theory suddenly seems incredibly appealing to you. Getting within arm's reach of a creature that could casually punt you over a nearby mountain range requires a level of primal bravery or sheer, desperate hunger that is very hard for a comfortable, modern mind to fully process. Yet the hunters lying directly beside you show absolutely no hesitation whatsoever. There is a quiet, intense, deeply professional focus radiating from them. They aren't looking at the massive, terrifying matriarch. They are carefully, systematically studying the outer edges of the herd. You follow their calculated gaze. Lagging slightly behind the main family group is a younger male. He is still absolutely enormous by any modern standard, roughly the size of a fully loaded city delivery van, but he walks with a slight, almost imperceptible limp in his back left leg. Perhaps he twisted it on a hidden river rock, or perhaps he barely survived a terrifying run-in with a pack of giant cave hyenas a few weeks ago. Whatever the original cause, that tiny, fleeting moment of weakness has distinctly marked him. The brutal, entirely unforgiving mathematics of Ice Age survival have instantly calculated his fate. He is the one. You watch the young bull use his impressive tusks to sweep a massive pile of fresh snow out of the way, exposing the dry, yellow, highly nutritious grasses buried beneath. He gracefully wraps his highly prehensile trunk around a thick tuft, ripping it forcefully out of the frozen earth with a loud, tearing sound that echoes faintly up the snowy valley walls. You can clearly hear the heavy, wet crunch of his massive molars grinding the tough fibres down. Those teeth you vaguely recall from some dusty natural history museum placard are roughly the exact size of standard house bricks, constantly wearing down and being systematically replaced throughout the animal's entire life. The wind suddenly shifts direction slightly, blowing directly up the ridge and right into your face. It carries the unmistakable, heavy, incredibly rich scent of the herd, a pungent, deeply musky mix of wet fur, damp earth, and crushed frozen vegetation. It is the raw, completely unfiltered smell of a wild world long before industrialization, before concrete sidewalks, and before exhaust fumes. It is absolutely terrifying, and it is profoundly beautiful. You are lying freezing in the snow, watching a magnificent creature that will one day become the ultimate tragic symbol of prehistoric extinction, a mythical beast eventually reduced to dusty bones and brightly lit museum dioramas. But right now, in this exact moment, he is vitally, powerfully, and undeniably alive. The lead hunter gives a sharp, entirely silent hand signal. The party immediately splits into two distinct, highly organized groups, moving down the ridge with an eerie, predatory silence that completely defies their bulky, heavy clothing. They're executing a highly coordinated, incredibly dangerous, ancient strategy. You realize, with a sudden sharp spike of icy adrenaline in your chest, that the quiet, peaceful, observational phase of the morning is officially over. You are no longer just lazily tracking a set of interesting footprints in the snow. You're about to actively participate in the oldest, most dramatic, and most high-stakes dance in all of human history. The towering main course is isolated, the trap is quietly being set, and as you nervously grip the rough wooden shaft of your spear, your knuckles turning stark white from the cold and the building tension, you realise that stepping out of the warm prehistoric kitchen this morning You carefully slide down the icy embankment, your heavy fur-wrapped boots desperately digging into the compacted snow to keep you from tumbling head over heels into the valley below. You are following the second, smaller group of hunters, moving in a wide, sweeping arc, to flank the isolated, limping young mammoth bull. Your idea of a high-stakes, stressful team-building exercise usually involves a highly awkward trust fall in a beige corporate conference room, or maybe frantically trying to escape a locked puzzle room with your co-workers while aggressively debating the meaning of a cryptic crossword clue. Out here in the brutal, beautiful cold of the Ice Age, team building means precisely coordinating a high-risk ambush on a living, breathing mountain of muscle, where a single misstep doesn't result in a sternly worded email from human resources, but rather in being casually, instantly trampled into the ancient permafrost. You grip the rough, heavy wooden shaft of your spear so tightly that your thick leather mittens creak loudly in the profound silence. You are acutely, entirely aware that your primary contribution to this elite hunting squad is basically acting as a highly visible, fleshy, and incredibly slow-moving distraction. The strategy playing out before you is a masterpiece of ancient, deadly geometry. The hunters are not simply running screaming at the beast in a chaotic, disorganized mob. That would be absolute suicide. Instead, they are using the natural, sweeping contours of the valley against the massive animal. The limping bull has unknowingly wandered into a shallow, narrowing depression in the landscape, a blind alley formed by two steep, rocky ridges, heavily choked with deep, impassable snowdrifts. The first group of hunters has already quietly positioned themselves at the wide mouth of this natural funnel, effectively cutting off the mammoth's only easy avenue of escape, back to the safety of the matriarch and the larger herd. You and your group are slowly creeping along the upper ridge, preparing to drop down and close the trap from the sides. The level of silent, instinctual communication between the clan members is staggering to witness. A slight tilt of a head, a raised chin, a subtle shifting of weight, entire complex tactical commands are seamlessly passed down the line without a single vocalized syllable breaking the frigid air. A mainstream historical fact that completely changes your perspective on this entire endeavor is the fundamental nature of Neanderthal weaponry. Unlike later modern humans who eventually invented lightweight, highly aerodynamic throwing spears and the ingenious atlatl to launch projectiles from a very safe distance, the people you are walking with right now rely almost entirely on incredibly heavy, thick-shafted thrusting spears. These formidable weapons are specifically designed not to be thrown, but to be held firmly in two hands and driven upward with massive, explosive physical force. This means that to successfully kill a mammoth, these hunters cannot safely strike from 30 yards away. They have to get intimately, terrifyingly close. They have to step directly inside the deadly sweeping radius of those massive ivory tusks and those heavy crushing feet. It is an unimaginably dangerous way to secure a meal. In fact, it is a quirky little fringe tidbit of biological archaeology that when scientists meticulously analyze the fossilized skeletal remains of adult Neanderthals, the specific repeating patterns of severe bone fractures and healed trauma they find do not resemble the injuries of typical ancient foragers. Instead, their fractured collarbones, compressed ribs, and broken limbs most closely match the exact injury profiles of modern professional rodeo riders. These ancient people were routinely, violently thrown, kicked, and crushed by the massive, angry megafauna they engaged in close quarters, heavy contact combat. Remembering this deeply unsettling fact, you instinctively take a very large, entirely deliberate step backward, trying to melt your soft, unarmored body as deeply into the freezing snowbank as physically possible. You hunker down behind a jagged outcropping of dark limestone, the biting cold of the rock seeping instantly through your heavy hide leggings. You can smell the sharp, metallic tang of adrenaline in your own mouth, mixing heavily with the pungent, musky, wet earth scent of the massive bull drifting up from the valley floor. The mammoth is still completely oblivious, his heavy, brick-sized molars loudly grinding down a massive tuft of frozen yellow grass. He is an absolute engine of slow, deliberate consumption. Historians still argue whether ancient hunters routinely used controlled brush fires to deliberately stampede these massive, heavily insulated animals into hidden bogs and natural traps, or if they relied entirely on extreme, agonizing patience and flawless stealth to gently herd them into vulnerable positions. Today, at least, there is no fire. There is only the agonizing, slow-motion tension of the cold trap tightening. The silence stretches out, taut and fragile, like a thin sinew string pulled to its absolute breaking point. You find yourself suddenly missing the soft, pillowy comfort of your living room couch with a burning, desperate intensity. Unlike a modern fast food drive-through, where the absolute biggest daily risk you face is getting the wrong dipping sauce packet with your order, the stakes out here are fundamentally binary. You either succeed entirely or you do not go home. Suddenly, the lead hunter down in the valley deliberately steps out from the cover of a skeletal larch tree. He does not yell. He does not wave his arms frantically. He simply stands his ground in the deep snow and forcefully strikes the heavy, blunt end of his thick wooden spear directly against a solid, hollow-sounding rock hidden beneath the powder. Thwack! The sharp, incredibly loud, unnatural wooden crack echoes violently across the quiet valley, bouncing sharply off the icy ridges. The young mammoth bull freezes instantly. The rhythmic, heavy grinding of his massive jaws completely stops. His huge, tattered ears, relatively small compared to modern African elephants, but still the size of thick leather dinner plates, flare outward, straining to locate the source of the sudden unnatural sound. He lets out a low, incredibly deep, vibrating rumble that you can actually feel resonating intensely in the hollows of your chest cavity, a sound more akin to a shifting, tectonic plate than an animal vocalization. He turns his massive, shaggy head, his small dark eyes locking directly onto the solitary hunter standing boldly in the open. The bull shifts his staggering weight, pivoting on his 3 good legs. He is surprisingly fast for a creature the size of a delivery van. He lowers his massive armoured head, aiming those terrifying, sweeping, parenthesis-shaped tusks directly at the tiny, fragile human, challenging him, and he charges. The sheer physical power of his movement is deeply, fundamentally terrifying. Every single time his massive footpads strike the earth, the frozen ground beneath you physically shudders. Thick, heavy plumes of white snow explode outward from his legs, like a massive organic snowplow moving at terrifying speed. The deep, heavy, wet sound of his ragged breathing fills the entire valley, a loud, rhythmic, terrifying locomotive engine of muscle and fury barreling directly toward the trap. But the mammoth is heavy, and the snow in the centre of the narrowing ravine is deceptively, incredibly deep. As he surges forward, fueled by panic and primal aggression, his injured back leg visibly struggles to find solid purchase in the shifting, powdery drifts. He begins to slow down, his massive, hairy chest ploughing heavily into a deep, hidden drift that completely obscures a treacherous, rocky sinkhole. He lets out a deafening, high-pitched, incredibly loud trumpet of profound frustration, tossing his massive head violently from side to side, sending thick, ropey strands of saliva and snot flying through the freezing air. He is violently bogged down, his forward momentum completely arrested by the unforgiving terrain. This is the exact fleeting moment the clan has been agonizingly waiting for. The second the mammoth's frantic, heavy movements are severely restricted by the deep snow, the entire hunting party completely abandons their stealth. They erupt from the surrounding rocks and trees with a terrifying, coordinated silence. There are no dramatic battle cries, no wasted energy, just a swift, incredibly violent and terrifyingly efficient convergence on the trapped giant. They move through the deep snow with a practiced, fluid grace that you can only helplessly admire from your safe, distant vantage point behind the limestone boulder. You watch, completely paralyzed by a potent mixture of pure awe and absolute, primal terror as the hunters seamlessly swarm the massive, struggling beast. They utilize the heavy, thick-shafted spears exactly as they were designed, driving the razor-sharp, expertly napped flint tips deep into the thick, protective layers of the mammoth's hide with explosive, two-handed, upward thrusts. They target the highly vulnerable areas completely missed by the thick, matted curtains of coarse hair, the soft, heavily veined underbelly, the thick, muscular base of the neck, and the heavily restricted flanks. It is a brutal, intensely intimate, and terrifyingly physical confrontation. The mammoth violently thrashes his massive head, his heavy tusks sweeping in wide, incredibly dangerous, deadly arcs, narrowly missing a hunter who fluidly ducks completely beneath the massive ivory beam, with literally an inch to spare. The chaotic, violent struggle is mercifully brief, but it feels like it stretches out for hours in your adrenaline-soaked mind. The sheer, overwhelming number of precise, deep coordinated strikes rapidly takes a heavy, fatal toll on the exhausted, trapped animal. The massive bull's deafening, angry trumpets slowly, inevitably turn into low, wet, exhausted, bubbling coughs. The thick, white clouds of steam erupting from his trunk become visibly thinner, weaker, and less frequent. Finally, with a massive, earth-shaking, deeply resonant groan that seems to echo from the very bedrock of the valley itself, the giant's front legs completely buckle. The towering, majestic mountain of shaggy brown fur and ancient muscle slowly, heavily collapses into the deep, blood-stained snow. The immediate aftermath of the violent strike is shockingly, intensely quiet. The massive, thrashing chaos of the hunt is entirely gone, instantly replaced by the vast, returning, empty silence of the Pleistocene landscape. The wind slowly picks up again, gently blowing a thin, dusting layer of fresh white powder over the massive, still form, resting heavily on the valley floor. The hunters slowly back away from the fallen giant, leaning heavily on their thick wooden spears, their broad chests heaving with deep, rapid, exhausted breaths. The thick steam rising from their sweat-soaked bodies completely mingles with the fading heat radiating from the massive mammoth, creating a hazy, ethereal, beautiful fog that hangs heavily over the kill site. You slowly stand up from behind your protective boulder, your knees shaking violently, your knuckles still completely white from gripping your completely unused, pristine spear. You take a long, deep, shaky breath, the incredibly sharp, freezing air painfully stinging the back of your dry throat. You survived the ambush. The clan survived the heavy, close-quarters combat. You look down at the massive fallen beast, feeling a complex, heavy wave of profound respect, ancient sadness, and undeniable, primal relief wash over you. The terrifying, incredibly dangerous phase of the morning is officially complete. You have successfully secured the ultimate prize. Now, as you begin the slow, heavy trek down into the ravine to join the exhausted, victorious hunters, you realize that the real, agonizingly hard physical labor of the prehistoric kitchen is only just beginning. The main course is secured, but you still have a very long way to go before you can finally sit down and enjoy a warm, savory bowl of that birch tar-sealed mammoth stew. You step slowly and cautiously down the steep, powdery incline of the ravine, your heavy boots sliding slightly in the deep, freshly disturbed snow. The intense, chaotic, blinding adrenaline of the ambush is rapidly draining from your system, leaving behind a profound, heavy, physical exhaustion that makes your limbs feel like they are made of solid, cold lead. The air down here in the basin of the valley is entirely still, heavily insulated from the howling winds sweeping across the ridges high above. As you approach the massive fallen form of the young woolly mammoth, the sheer, unimaginable scale of the animal becomes overwhelmingly, almost absurdly apparent. Standing right next to its massive, shaggy flank is exactly like standing next to a fully furred, gently steaming, organic brick wall. The thick, white plumes of heat radiating off the massive carcass create a dense, localized fog bank in the freezing air, wrapping the entire quiet scene in a soft, ethereal, beautifully hazy glow. You find yourself staring blankly at the staggering mountain of potential food lying in the snow, a profound logistical nightmare slowly dawning on your thoroughly modern, grocery store conditioned brain. You are effectively tasked with helping to carve a prehistoric Thanksgiving turkey the exact size and weight of a fully loaded municipal garbage truck, using absolutely nothing but a handful of glorified rocks. Back home, you occasionally struggle to successfully disjoint a pre-cooked rotisserie chicken with a pair of specialized kitchen shears without accidentally launching a drumstick across the dining room floor. The idea of breaking down this colossal, armor-plated giant seems not just physically daunting but mathematically impossible. Your refrigerator's crisper drawer is currently struggling to effectively contain half a forgotten cabbage and some wilted celery. It is entirely unprepared for the 3 tons of premium, free-range prehistoric brisket currently resting at your feet. But the seasoned Neanderthal hunters are not standing around looking overwhelmed. They are moving with a quiet, methodical, highly practiced efficiency that instantly commands your complete respect. There is no frantic, chaotic hacking. There is no wild, disorganized butchery. The massive hunt has seamlessly transitioned into an incredibly focused, deeply rhythmic, and surprisingly delicate anatomical harvest. The lead hunter, a broad-shouldered man with a deeply lined face and quiet, intelligent eyes, completely ignores the massive carcass for a moment. Instead, he calmly sits down, cross-legged, in the powdery snow, resting a thick, heavy leather pad across his knees. He reaches into a woven hip pouch and pulls out a large, grey, unshaped nodule of raw flint and a heavy, smooth piece of hardened reindeer antler. He is not preparing to chop, he is preparing to craft. You kneel down quietly in the snow beside him, watching the ancient, mesmerizing process begin. He raises the heavy antler billet and strikes the raw flint core with a sharp, incredibly precise, glancing blow. Clack! The crisp, highly satisfying, percussive sound rings out sharply in the quiet, muffled air of the snowy ravine. A long, thin, incredibly sharp flake of grey stone cleanly detaches from the core and falls softly onto the leather pad. He rotates the core slightly in his heavily calloused hand, expertly judging the complex, invisible angles of the stone's internal crystalline structure, and strikes it again. Clack, clack, clack. It is the rhythmic, hypnotic, deeply soothing ASMR of the ancient world. With every single, calculated strike, he is effortlessly producing brand new, flawlessly sharp blades directly from the earth. A mainstream historical fact that fundamentally changes the way you view these ancient tools is the staggering, almost unbelievable sharpness of freshly knapped flint. Because of the specific, unique way the stone breaks, a process geologists call conchoidal fracture, the cutting edge of a perfectly struck flint blade does not taper down to a microscopic serration like modern forged metal knives do. Instead, the stone forcefully shears away until the very edge of the blade is literally only a few single molecules thick. Your extraordinarily expensive, painstakingly curated set of high-carbon Japanese steel kitchen knives currently sitting proudly in their beautiful bamboo block on your kitchen counter are, on a microscopic level, completely dull, jagged butter knives compared to the piece of ancient grey rock this man just casually created in 3 seconds. He finishes preparing a handful of thin, razor-sharp blades and completely, unexpectedly, hands one directly to you. You take it very carefully, pinching the dull, thicker back edge between your heavy leather mittens. The sharp cutting edge is translucent, beautifully thin, and absolutely terrifying. It is a quirky, little fringe tidbit of modern medical science that certain highly specialized, elite cosmetic surgeons and ophthalmologists today actually prefer to use custom-made obsidian and flint scalpels for their most delicate, incredibly sensitive procedures. The impossibly thin, molecular edge of the stone blade parts the human tissue so cleanly, so flawlessly, and with such minimal cellular tearing that the resulting incisions heal significantly faster and leave almost zero visible scarring compared to the finest, most expensive surgical steel instruments on the planet. You are holding a piece of medical-grade, flawless surgical technology in the middle of a freezing Ice Age wasteland, completely free of charge, and you are about to use it to prepare dinner. The lead hunter gently gestures toward a massive, exposed section of the mammoth's thick flank. It is finally time to get to work. You take a slow, deep breath, stepping closer to the massive, steaming side of the beast. The coarse, reddish-brown hair is incredibly thick, heavily matted with frozen mud and ancient, deeply pungent oils. Your job right now is not to hack through heavy bone. Your job is the delicate, highly precise work of safely separating the valuable, thick hides from the dense, nutrient-rich layers beneath. You press the razor-sharp edge of your freshly knapped flint blade against the thick, rubbery skin and apply a very slow, very gentle, perfectly steady downward pressure. The result is absolutely astonishing. There is no heavy resistance, no frustrating sawing motion required. The impossibly sharp stone parts the incredibly thick, leathery hide with a soft, deeply satisfying, almost completely silent shh sound. It glides through the tough, resilient tissue with the exact same smooth, effortless ease that a hot metal knife glides cleanly through a block of softened room-temperature butter. You pull the blade in a long, continuous, perfectly straight line, completely mesmerized by the flawless, uninterrupted perfection of the cut. Beneath the thick skin lies the massive, vital layer of dense, insulating brown fat, a deeply prized, highly caloric, absolutely essential survival food that will eventually form the rich, glossy, luxurious base of your bubbling ancient stew back at the cave. The other hunters are working in quiet, synchronized harmony all around the massive animal. There is a deep, profound sense of focused reverence in their slow, deliberate movements. They are not simply butchering an animal, they are carefully, respectfully dismantling a miracle that will absolutely ensure their entire family's survival through the darkest, most brutal months of the freezing winter. Historians still argue whether these massive, organized prehistoric kill sites serve purely as pragmatic, utilitarian meat processing zones, or if they simultaneously functioned as highly significant, deeply sacred, temporary outdoor altars where the ancient clans performed complex, quiet rituals of deep gratitude and spiritual respects to honor the immense spirit of the fallen giant before breaking it down for food. Watching the incredibly gentle, almost tender way the lead hunter handles the massive, heavy cuts of meat, ensuring absolutely nothing is wasted or carelessly ruined, you strongly lean toward the latter theory. There is a quiet, beautiful holiness to this incredibly heavy, deeply necessary labor. You spend the next several hours lost in the slow, rhythmic, highly focused flow state of the delicate work. Your hands become comfortably warm, heavily insulated by the thick, steaming heat radiating constantly from the massive carcass. You expertly use your razor-sharp stone blade to meticulously separate the massive, beautifully marbled slabs of rich, dense muscle from the heavy, thick white bands of connective tissue. You are gathering the absolute finest, most tender choice cuts for the heavy wooden cooking bowl waiting back by the warm hearth. Every single slab of meat you carefully slice away is incredibly heavy, easily weighing 30 or 40 pounds, requiring you to use your entire body weight just to safely heave it onto a large, clean, freshly laid tarp made from a previously tanned animal skin, resting lightly on top of the powdery snow. You wipe a thick bead of cold sweat from your forehead with the back of your heavy, fur-clad forearm. The sheer, overwhelming physical exertion of meticulously processing an animal this massive is deeply, profoundly exhausting, entirely engaging every single muscle group in your back and shoulders. You suddenly realize that you have easily burned off roughly 3,000 calories today just preparing to cook dinner. It is the ultimate, prehistoric, highly involuntary CrossFit workout, completely devoid of heavy kettlebells and encouraging, overly enthusiastic gym music, but entirely guaranteed to make you sleep like an absolute rock tonight. As the pale, weak winter sun finally begins to dip low toward the jagged, icy horizon, casting long, deep, beautifully purple shadows across the vast valley floor, the monumental task of securing the prime cuts is finally complete. The hunters begin securely wrapping the massive, heavy slabs of rich meat and thick brown fat tightly within the thick, clean hide bundles, securely tying them off with long, strong strips of tough, fibrous animal sinew. You carefully wipe your flawlessly sharp, trusty flint blade clean on a handful of dry snow and slip it respectfully back into the leather pouch at your waist. The razor-thin stone has served you perfectly, completely redefining your entire modern understanding of what a simple rock can actually accomplish in the hands of a skilled, knowledgeable artisan. You grip the thick, heavy sinew straps of your massive, tightly wrapped bundle of meat, throwing your entire body weight heavily forward to drag it through the deep, squeaking snow. The quiet, exhausted, highly satisfied hunting party slowly begins the long, arduous, heavy trek back up the steep ridge and out of the darkening valley. Your muscles are screaming, your heavy boots feel like they weigh 100 pounds each, and the biting wind is slowly beginning to pick up again as the evening twilight aggressively settles in. But as you trudge slowly through the beautiful, frozen landscape, dragging the ultimate, hard-won prize securely behind you, a deep, profound sense of quiet, peaceful anticipation completely fills your chest. The incredibly dangerous hunt is entirely over. The meticulous, heavy butchery is completely finished. Now, all that incredibly rich, savoury potential is heading directly back to that beautifully crafted, safely sheltered, brightly glowing hearth. The prehistoric kitchen is fully stocked. The heavy granite stones are glowing red hot in the fire, and the greatest, most deeply satisfying meal of your entire life is finally about to begin. You finally drag that incredibly heavy, tightly sinew-wrapped bundle of mammoth meat entirely over the threshold of the limestone cave. The familiar, incredibly comforting scent of dry spruce wood smoke wrapping warmly around you like a heavy, protective blanket. The intense, aggressively biting cold of the darkening tundra instantly vanishes from your skin, completely replaced by the radiating, beautiful, deep heat of the hearth you so carefully built earlier this evening. You let go of the thick, abrasive dragging straps, allowing the massive hide bundle to drop heavily onto the dusty cave floor with a deeply satisfying, muffled thump. Your shoulders slump completely, your lower back aches with a dull, throbbing, rhythmic intensity, and you are entirely, profoundly out of breath. Back home, you firmly believe that taking two separate, highly inconvenient trips to carry your reusable grocery bags from the trunk of your car to the kitchen counter is a fundamental sign of absolute personal weakness, choosing instead to perfectly balance 12 cutting plastic handles on 3 strained fingers until your hands turn a deep, concerning shade of purple. But out here, after successfully dragging 40 pounds of premium prehistoric brisket through knee-deep squeaking snow, you completely and happily concede defeat. You slowly, heavily sink down right next to the roaring fire, letting the glorious, superheated air slowly melt the thick, stubborn crust of white frost right off your heavy eyelashes. Your beautifully crafted, freshly birch tar-sealed wooden cooking bowl is sitting exactly where you safely left it, completely watertight, entirely intact, and patiently holding its precious payload of icy, slushy river water. Deep inside the roaring heart of the fire, those heavy, dense granite cobbles you carefully selected are currently glowing with a furious, highly dangerous, bright cherry-red intensity, silently and efficiently banking massive amounts of sheer thermal energy beneath the flames. You have the cold water, you have the intense heat, and you finally have the incredibly fresh meat. But you cannot simply toss a massive cold raw chunk of lean muscle directly into icy water and expect a magically gourmet stew. You deeply need a foundation. You need a rich, incredibly savoury, highly caloric base to completely transform this watery, uninspired mixture into a luxurious, intensely life-sustaining broth. The lead hunter, moving with that quiet, deeply graceful efficiency, calmly walks over to your side of the warm hearth. He is carrying something that looks significantly less like a piece of food and vastly more like a heavy piece of ancient architectural masonry. He gently, carefully sets it down on a flat, solid, deeply scarred slab of limestone, resting permanently near the edge of the fire. It is a woolly mammoth femur, the massive, incredibly thick upper leg bone of the giant you just spent the entire afternoon tracking and hunting. To simply say it is large is an absolute, laughable understatement. It is roughly the exact size, weight and general density of a cast iron city fire hydrant. The bone is deeply yellowed, heavily textured and incredibly robust, a sheer structural marvel of evolutionary engineering perfectly designed to easily, effortlessly support the walking weight of a 3-ton animal navigating a frozen, uneven world. You stare blankly at the massive, heavy bone, slightly confused by its presence in the kitchen area. There is absolutely no meat left on it whatsoever. The highly skilled hunters expertly and meticulously stripped it completely clean back at the kill site with those flawlessly sharp surgical flint blades. But a mainstream historical fact is that in the brutal, freezing, highly unforgiving calorie deficit of the Ice Age, lean muscle meat is actually not the most prized nutritional possession. If you attempt to survive by eating only incredibly lean meat without any accompanying heavy fats or complex carbohydrates, your body simply cannot process the heavy protein effectively, inevitably leading to a highly dangerous, potentially fatal metabolic condition known as protein poisoning or rabbit starvation. What these ancient, incredibly savvy hunters truly prize, the absolute, undeniable holy grail of prehistoric nutrition, is the incredibly dense, highly caloric, luxuriously fatty prize. Locked securely away deep inside this massive, unyielding vault of solid bone, you are going after the rich marrow. But physically getting to that deep marrow requires an entirely different set of physical skills than the delicate, quiet, surgical slicing you carefully perform down in the snowy valley. You absolutely cannot cut this dense bone. You have to entirely, violently shatter it. The older woman wearing the beautifully polished cave bear-tooth necklace slowly sits down directly across from you and wordlessly hands you a heavy, perfectly rounded, beautifully smooth quartzite river cobble. This heavy rock is your ancient hammerstone. She simply points a thick, calloused finger to the massive mammoth femur resting solidly on the flat limestone anvil. It is officially time to do some incredibly loud, highly aggressive, heavy impact prehistoric kitchen prep. You firmly grip the heavy quartzite hammerstone in both of your cold, aching hands, slowly raising it high above your head. You bring it down with a massive, explosive, highly involuntary grunt of sheer physical effort, striking the absolute thickest, central part of the yellowed bone. Thud! The remarkably heavy stone simply bounces harmlessly off the dense ancient femur, instantly sending a violent, highly painful, deeply vibrating shockwave travelling straight up both of your forearms and settling uncomfortably deep into your back teeth. The massive bone doesn't even have a microscopic scratch on it. You suddenly painfully realise that the highly obnoxious upstairs neighbours in your modern apartment building, who sound like they are aggressively bowling with heavy cinder blocks every single Sunday morning, are probably just enthusiastically, loudly, practicing their ancient, heavy marrow extraction techniques. The older Neanderthal woman chuckles softly, a low, beautifully rumbling, deeply chesty sound that completely puts your bruised ego at ease. She gently, gracefully takes the heavy hammerstone directly from your aching, vibrating hands and silently demonstrates the proper technique. It is absolutely not about wild, blind, exhausting, downward force. It is entirely about highly focused, precise, deeply structural targeting. She carefully, meticulously examines the thick, heavy shaft of the bone in the flickering orange firelight, searching closely for natural, completely invisible, microscopic fault lines running deeply within the dense calcium matrix. She subtly adjusts the exact angle of the massive femur on the stone anvil, firmly gripping the heavy quartzite hammer. She raises it just a few short, deliberate inches and brings it down with a sharp, incredibly fast, explosive whipping motion of her strong wrist. Crack. The resulting sound is incredibly sharp, a deafening, aggressively percussive gunshot that loudly and violently echoes off the low, sloping ceiling of the rock shelter. It is a deeply satisfying, entirely conclusive, physically heavy sound. A massive, jagged, highly complex spiderweb fracture instantly, completely covers the thick, central shaft of the dense bone. She calmly hands the heavy hammerstone back to you, silently gesturing for you to proudly finish the job. You carefully, nervously mimic her precise, highly controlled snapping motion, bringing the heavy stone down directly onto the exact center of the deep fracture. Crack! With a loud, heavy, intensely satisfying splintering groan, the massive mammoth femur violently breaks completely in two, falling heavily open on the flat stone anvil, exactly like a heavy, ancient, pale treasure chest, completely unlocking its secrets. You lean in closely, completely mesmerized by the deep, incredibly rich prize now completely exposed and hidden safely inside. The central hollow cavity of the massive shattered bone is completely filled with a remarkably thick, dense, heavily opaque pale yellow substance. It visually looks remarkably like incredibly heavy, slightly firm, unwhipped butter. This is the marrow. It is a pure, unadulterated, highly concentrated block of essential fatty acids, critical vitamins, and pure raw survival energy. You reach carefully into your woven leather belt pouch and pull out a specially carved, beautifully elongated piece of highly polished reindeer antler, its tip meticulously, patiently flattened and slightly scooped perfectly by its ancient maker for this exact, highly specific, delicate task. You carefully, slowly insert the smooth bone scoop deep into the dense, fatty marrow cavity, applying a very slow, completely steady, heavy pressure. The rich, dense fat yields beautifully to the tool, curling up into incredibly thick, deeply luxurious ribbons on the edge of your ancient spoon. It is incredibly oily, instantly coating the carved antler in a thick, highly shiny, beautifully protective layer. It is a quirky little fringe tidbit of biological archaeology that early human populations did not just exclusively, hungrily eat this incredibly rich, dense fat. They often completely and deliberately covered themselves in it. Rendered animal fat and raw bone marrow were heavily, routinely used as deeply hydrating, incredibly effective, heavily protective skin moisturizers to perfectly shield their exposed faces and hands from the brutal, intensely drying, aggressively freezing Ice Age winter winds. Forget your incredibly expensive, microscopic, highly glass-packaged jar of luxury department store night cream, vaguely infused with crushed pearls and empty promises. Generously slathering your face in raw, perfectly organic, unrefined mammoth marrow is the absolute ultimate, deeply authentic, highly protective, prehistoric anti-aging secret. Gently, deliberately tap the edge of the smooth antler against the thick, highly textured bark rim, letting the massive, heavy dollop of pure, unadulterated fat slide smoothly off the tool and fall gracefully into the icy river water with a soft, heavy, deeply satisfying plop. Because heavy fat is fundamentally, scientifically lighter than cold water, the thick marrow immediately safely bobs right back to the calm surface, slowly breaking apart into several large, gently floating, highly luxurious islands of pure, unrefined flavour. You immediately go right back to the shattered bone and repeat the deeply satisfying, highly rhythmic, incredibly quiet process. Scoop, carry, tap, plop. Scoop, carry, tap, plop. You are aggressively, incredibly generously, heavily buttering the freezing water. Historians still argue whether early ancient hominids initially developed their highly complex, heavy stone tools specifically and exclusively to safely scavenge this deeply hidden, incredibly nutrient-dense marrow from massive, rotting carcasses completely abandoned by dangerous apex predators like saber-toothed cats, or if cracking heavy bones was just a secondary, happy, highly caloric bonus to successfully actively hunting the live animals themselves. Watching the sheer, staggering volume of incredibly rich, fatty calories you are currently depositing directly into your ancient wooden slow cooker, you easily and completely understand exactly why a small, hungry, scavenging hominid would happily risk their entire life just to smash open a single, quietly discarded leg bone. It is an absolute, undeniable, massive nutritional jackpot, completely vital for winter survival. You completely meticulously empty both massive halves of the violently shattered femur, heavily and entirely coating the calm surface of your icy water with a remarkably thick, completely opaque, pale yellow layer of raw floating marrow. Right now, in the dim flickering light, it frankly just looks like very cold, highly questionable, unappetizing chunks of floating fat. But you know exactly, precisely what is about to happen next. When that icy water finally violently boils, all of that incredibly dense, heavy marrow is going to completely melt down, forcefully and beautifully emulsifying directly into the hot liquid to create a profoundly thick, highly glossy, impossibly rich, deeply savoury foundation for your ancient stew. It will flawlessly add a profound, heavy, deeply luxurious mouthfeel that perfectly mimics the very best, intensely simmered, highly expensive tonkotsu ramen broths currently found in the finest modern noodle shops, but heavily elevated with a uniquely wild, incredibly earthy, deeply prehistoric depth that simply cannot be replicated today. You lazily toss the completely empty, thoroughly scraped, hollow shards of pale bone into the dark, shadowed back corner of the quiet cave, carelessly adding to the massive, ancient, dusty pile of prehistoric kitchen debris that will eventually entirely fascinate and deeply confuse a dedicated team of modern, highly educated archaeologists exactly 50,000 years from now. You carefully wipe your heavily greased, intensely shiny hands on a spare rough piece of dry scrap leather, the intense heavy scent of the raw fat completely and pleasantly clinging to your warm skin. The absolute hardest, most aggressively physically demanding and heavily labour-intensive parts of the entire Ice Age dinner prep are officially, thankfully, behind you. The hearth fire is beautifully, radiantly hot, the heavy wooden pot is fully sealed, the massive, tightly wrapped cuts of prime meat are waiting patiently nearby, and the incredibly rich, deeply fatty base of your broth is perfectly, flawlessly staged. The cave is deeply quiet, wonderfully warm, and heavily filled with a profound, heavy sense of impending, deeply satisfying culinary success. The canvas is entirely prepared. Now, it is time to slowly, carefully introduce the delicate, complex, beautifully foraged flavours of the frozen wild. You sit back on the dusty, packed earth of the cave floor, the lingering, heavy scent of the rich mammoth marrow slowly settling into the warm, smoky air of the rock shelter. You wipe your heavily greased, intensely shiny hands on a rough scrap of dried leather, feeling a deep, profoundly satisfying sense of culinary accomplishment. Your beautifully crafted, miraculously sealed wooden bowl currently holds a massive, freezing pool of icy river water and several thick, completely opaque, pale yellow islands of pure, unrefined fat. It is the absolute perfect foundation for a masterpiece. But right now, if you were to somehow miraculously boil this thick, heavy mixture and serve it as is, it would taste exactly like what it is. Hot, vaguely meaty water. You desperately need to introduce complexity. You need to elevate this heavy, highly caloric survival food into something that actually vaguely resembles a genuinely enjoyable meal, preventing the ancient equivalent of a very angry Gordon Ramsay from suddenly storming into the cave to aggressively yell at you about your profound lack of basic seasoning. You reach down to your woven belt and carefully untie the small, tightly bound leather pouch you so diligently filled during your freezing, deeply stressful foraging expedition earlier this evening. The thin, fibrous sinew cord slowly gives way, and you gently peel back the soft, overlapping flaps of the cured animal hide. Instantly, an incredibly vibrant, sharply fragrant cloud of complex wild aromas completely escapes the dark confines of the pouch, aggressively pushing back the heavy, pervasive smell of wood smoke and raw meat. You lean in very closely, closing your heavy eyelids, and simply inhale deeply. The scent is remarkably fresh, profoundly green, and intensely earthy. It smells like the deep, hidden, surviving heart of the frozen forest. Back in your modern, highly convenient life, your idea of reaching for complex aromatics usually involves desperately rummaging through a cluttered, sticky spice cabinet, only to sadly uncover a half-empty, suspiciously dusty glass jar of dried oregano that officially expired sometime during the last presidential administration. Out here, your spice rack is the entire brutal, beautifully untamed Pleistocene landscape, and everything you're about to use was literally completely alive and actively growing just a few short hours ago. You carefully reach into the pouch and gently extract the thick, gnarly handful of wild, bitter mustard greens you carefully plucked from beneath the powdery snow. They are slightly bruised now, the dark, jagged leaves slightly wilted from the cold journey and the heavy, radiating heat of your body, but their essential, highly pungent oils are still entirely, vibrantly intact. You hold the leaves up to the warm, flickering orange light of the hearth fire. They look incredibly tough, fibrous, and deeply unappetizing in their completely raw state. But you are not making a delicate modern summer salad. You are making a heavy, aggressive, slow-cooked Ice Age stew. You begin to systematically, rhythmically tear the dark leaves apart with your bare hands. Ripe, ripe, ripe. The sharp, highly satisfying sound of the tough, fibrous cellulose structures violently giving way echoes softly over the constant, gentle crackle of the blazing spruce logs. With every single tear, a fresh, intensely sharp, almost aggressively peppery burst of aroma is released directly into the air. You purposefully tear them into large, rustic, highly uneven chunks, completely ignoring any modern desire for fine, delicate, Michelin-star julienne cuts. You carefully gather the torn, deeply fragrant pile of bruised greens and gently, deliberately drop them directly into the dark, freezing water of the heavy wooden bowl. They hit the calm surface with a soft, feathery rustle, floating gently alongside the massive pale islands of thick yellow marrow, creating a beautiful, highly contrasting, visual mosaic of vibrant forest green and rich, heavy animal fat. Next, you plunge your fingers slightly deeper into the bottom of the soft leather pouch, carefully bypassing the tough, starchy tubers you are saving for later, and pull out a tiny, tightly closed handful of dark, incredibly small spheres. These are the wild mustard seeds. They are infinitesimally small, hard, and entirely unassuming, completely hiding their intense, fiery potential behind a smooth, deeply brown, almost completely black exterior. You cannot simply toss these hard, unyielding little seeds entirely whole into the freezing broth and hope for the best. Their thick, protective outer hulls are entirely waterproof, designed completely by nature to safely survive being deeply buried in the freezing permafrost for decades. If you don't aggressively break them open, they will simply pass completely through you without surrendering a single tiny drop of their sharp, complex flavour. You must crush them. You glance around this dusty, firelit perimeter of the cooking area and quickly spot a smooth, slightly concave slab of heavy grey slate resting securely on the ground, completely accompanied by a small, perfectly round, highly polished river stone that fits flawlessly into the exact centre of your palm. It is a primitive, completely unrefined, but incredibly effective ancient mortar and pestle. A mainstream historical fact that completely shatters the entirely meat-obsessed, highly inaccurate, modern paleo diet myth is that early humans and Neanderthals were actually highly prolific, incredibly skilled processors of complex plant materials. Archaeologists constantly and routinely find these heavily worn, deeply scratched grinding stones at ancient campsites. Their microscopic, deeply embedded crevices, completely packed with the fossilized, crushed remnants of wild seeds, tough grains and complex starches, absolutely proving that our ancient ancestors fully understood the vital, essential importance of heavily processing their gathered carbohydrates and tough spices long before the official dawn of organized agriculture. You carefully deposit the tiny, hard mustard seeds directly onto the center of the flat slate slab. You grip the smooth, heavy riverstone tightly in your hand, pressing it firmly down onto the dark seeds with a slow, deliberate, heavy pressure. You begin to grind, using a slow, forceful, deeply rhythmic, circular motion. Scratch, crunch, scratch, crunch. The deeply satisfying, heavily abrasive sound of stone aggressively grinding against stone, completely shattering the hard, tiny seed hulls, fills the quiet space of the rock shelter. It is a slow, highly manual, incredibly physical process. It takes a solid 5 minutes of hard, sustained, muscular effort to completely reduce the tiny handful of seeds into a coarse, highly aromatic powder. It is vastly different from simply tossing your modern ingredients into a massively overpowered, ridiculously expensive electric food processor and completely obliterating them in 3 seconds flat. A modern morning ritual that usually sounds remarkably like a jet engine violently taking off and inevitably wakes up every single deeply annoyed neighbour within a 3-block radius. Here, the slow rhythmic grinding is completely peaceful, profoundly intentional, and deeply, beautifully quiet. As the tiny seed hulls violently crack and completely shatter under the heavy, relentless weight of the stone, an intense, sharply pungent, incredibly bright aroma forcefully hits the back of your throat. It is the unmistakable, highly potent smell of pure, unadulterated wild mustard. You carefully use the flat edge of your incredibly sharp, trustworthy flint blade to meticulously scrape the coarse, deeply fragrant brown powder entirely off the slate slab and seamlessly transfer it directly into the heavy wooden cooking bowl. As the highly concentrated, spicy powder hits the surface of the freezing water, it immediately begins to slowly fan out, completely diffusing its complex, heavily trapped oils across the dark, icy surface. But the symphony of wild prehistoric seasonings is still not entirely complete. You reach deeply back into your woven belt pouch one final time, carefully extracting a small, heavy handful of slightly sticky, deeply resinous, pale yellow kernels. These are extremely precious, highly prized wild pine nuts, meticulously, painstakingly gathered from the tightly closed cones of the massive, ancient evergreens trees lining the high, windswept ridges of the distant mountains. They are incredibly dense, heavily packed with rich, luxurious plant fats and a deep, deeply earthy, beautifully sweet flavour profile. You place the sticky, pale nuts directly onto the same heavy slate grinding stone, completely surrounded by the lingering, highly fragrant remnants of the sharp mustard powder. You take the smooth river rock and begin to gently, methodically crush them. Because they are so incredibly rich in natural heavy oils, they do not simply shatter into a dry, dusty powder like the hard mustard seeds did. Instead, under the heavy, rhythmic, twisting pressure of the stone, they slowly, beautifully begin to mash together, completely combining with the leftover sharp mustard dust to form a remarkably thick, heavily textured, incredibly oily, deeply fragrant paste. This is a quirky little fringe tidbit of biological archaeology. Scientists, heavily utilizing advanced, highly complex microscopic residue analysis on ancient, heavily worn stone grinding tools, have actually found precisely this: traces of crushed, highly oily nuts, completely and deliberately mixed together with intensely sharp, wild aromatic seeds. You are essentially, painstakingly, making the world's very first, incredibly authentic, prehistoric pesto, completely inventing a complex, deeply savoury culinary technique tens of thousands of years before anyone in modern Italy had ever even conceptually considered the existence of a fresh basil leaf. If you aggressively slapped this highly aromatic, dark, deeply oily smear onto a rough, charred piece of artisanal sourdough bread right now, you could easily and confidently charge $22 for it at a highly trendy, poorly lit pop-up restaurant in Brooklyn. You use your fingers to carefully, meticulously scrape every single precious, highly sticky ounce of the rich pine nut and mustard paste completely off the heavy stone slab. It feels incredibly dense, heavily textured, and deeply oily against your skin. You confidently flick the heavy, sticky dollop directly into the center of the wooden bowl. It immediately sinks slightly into the dark, freezing water, completely clinging to the rough, fibrous edges of the floating, torn mustard greens. You finally reach for the last, delicate component of your gathered bounty. You gently pull out the deeply bruised, highly delicate, papery blossoms of the wild chamomile and ancient yarrow. Unlike the incredibly tough greens and the hard, unyielding seeds, these fragile, highly medicinal flowers require absolutely no violent, heavy processing whatsoever. You simply, gently rub them softly between your palms, crushing the tiny dried petals until they slowly begin to flake apart, releasing their deeply floral, wonderfully sweet, highly soothing, incredibly mild aroma into the smoky air. You sprinkle them delicately, heavily, completely across the surface of the water, like a beautifully soft, ancient floral garnish. Historians still argue whether early, highly intelligent hominid populations deliberately and meticulously seasoned their heavy meals purely for the profound, elevated culinary pleasure of creating deeply complex, highly satisfying flavor profiles, or if they simply, pragmatically added these intensely pungent, highly active medicinal herbs strictly for their powerful, completely undeniable antimicrobial properties, desperately utilizing them as a purely functional chemical tool to heavily suppress bacterial growth and actively help preserve their massive hard-won caches of raw meat. Looking down right now into your beautifully prepped, heavily seasoned, incredibly complex wooden cooking bowl, you strongly, deeply suspect that it was a highly joyful, completely inseparable mixture of both. The ancient people were absolute, undisputed masters of brutal, unforgiving survival, but they were also entirely undeniably human, possessing a deep, fundamental, purely biological appreciation for a genuinely, profoundly good-tasting meal. You reach over and pick up a clean, completely stripped, highly smooth branch of dry birchwood, carefully dipping it deep into the heavy, beautifully fragrant liquid. You begin to slowly, methodically, quietly stir the incredibly cold, slushy mixture. Slosh, swirl, slosh, swirl. The gentle, highly rhythmic, incredibly soothing sound of the heavy liquid moving slowly against the rough, beautifully textured, birch tar-sealed walls of the massive wooden bowl is pure, deeply relaxing, auditory bliss. You watch completely mesmerized as the deep, vibrant green chunks of the torn mustard leaves, the pale, completely opaque heavy islands of the rich bone marrow, the dark, widely diffused specks of the crushed seeds, and the thick, deeply oily clumps of the rich pine nut paste, all slowly, beautifully, lazily swirl together in the freezing, dark water. The prehistoric canvas is completely, flawlessly painted. The heavy, incredibly rich foundation is securely laid, and the complex, deeply wild, beautifully foraged symphony of ancient seasoning is entirely, perfectly integrated. You slowly pull the stirring stick out of the dark water, gently tapping it twice against the thick wooden rim. The cold, highly complex, deeply flavoured preparation phase is officially, thankfully, over. Now you must finally turn your complete, undivided attention entirely back to the roaring, superheated back on the beautifully seasoned, freezing heart of the blazing hearth fire. It is time to completely harness the terrifying, intensely dangerous power of the glowing granite. It is finally time to cook. You turn your back on the beautifully seasoned, freezing cold mixture, resting quietly in its heavy wooden bowl, and face the roaring, superheated heart of the cave's main fire. The heat radiating off the established bed of coals is an absolute physical wall of pure thermal energy. It presses heavily against your face, instantly drying out your eyes and making the thick fur of your heavy clothing smell faintly of warm toasted dust. Deep inside the absolute hottest, white-orange centre of the blaze, those dense, heavy river cobbles you carefully selected earlier have undergone a terrifying, magnificent transformation. They are no longer grey, unassuming pieces of cold granite. They are currently pulsing with a deep, violent, incredibly dangerous cherry red glow, completely saturated with easily over 1,000 degrees of trapped heat. If an agent from modern workplace safety regulations were to magically appear in the cave right now, they would instantly write you a massive fine just for looking at this setup, let alone attempting to operate it without heavy, insulated, industrial-grade welder's gauntlets. But out here, in the brutal reality of the Pleistocene epoch, OSHA does not exist, and your dinner absolutely depends on your ability to successfully juggle glowing prehistoric lava rocks. You reach for the two long, thick, freshly cut branches of green oak you set aside near the perimeter of the hearth. These are your ancient makeshift tongs. You purposefully selected branches that were still completely alive, heavy with fresh, wet sap and dense internal moisture. Precisely so. They wouldn't instantly combust the second you thrust them into the blazing coals. You grip one thick branch firmly in each hand, crossing them slightly like a pair of massive, clumsy, entirely uncooperative chopsticks. Back home, you occasionally struggle to securely grab a single, slippery cherry tomato from a salad bar using perfectly engineered, spring-loaded stainless steel tongs. Now, you are attempting to safely grip a heavily rounded 10-pound sphere of glowing, superheated stone using two slippery sticks, while simultaneously trying very hard not to accidentally drop it directly onto your soft, incredibly vulnerable, hide-wrapped toes. You take a deep, slow, steadying breath, squinting aggressively against the intense, blinding glare of the firebed. You plunge the thick green oak branches directly into the roaring coals. The wet wood instantly begins to hiss violently, weeping thick, white, fiercely pungent smoke as its internal moisture aggressively boils away in the extreme heat. You carefully, nervously maneuver the ends of the branches around the largest, brightest, most intensely glowing granite cobble. You squeeze the rough sticks tightly together, relying entirely on heavy friction and pure, unadulterated grip strength. You slowly, agonizingly lift the heavy stone completely out of the fire. It is terrifyingly heavy, and the intense radiating heat completely sears the sensitive skin of your knuckles. You step backward, carefully pivoting away from the hearth, holding the glowing, pulsing rock securely over the dusty floor, walking with the overly cautious, stiff-legged waddle of someone entirely aware that they are holding a literal thermal bomb. You slowly, carefully shuffle over to the heavy wooden basin, the dark, slushy river water, completely dotted with the floating, pale islands of raw mammoth marrow and the vibrant, torn greens, sits completely still, perfectly anticipating the massive thermal shock to come. You gently lower the glowing red rock. You do not simply drop it from a high distance. Doing so would aggressively splash boiling, fat-laden water completely over your arms and face, ending your ancient culinary career in a highly agonizing, severely blistering disaster. You lower the heavy stone carefully until it just barely, softly, touches the calm, dark surface of the liquid. The reaction is instantaneous. violent and completely deafening. A massive, explosive, highly aggressive hiss rips entirely through the quiet rock shelter, sounding remarkably like a massive, angry prehistoric serpent suddenly waking up. The second the 1,000-degree stone completely submerges, the freezing cold water, touching its surface instantly, violently flashes directly into thick, expanding steam. A towering, billowing, magnificent column of thick white vapour forcefully erupts from the wooden bowl, shooting aggressively toward the low, sloped ceiling of the cave. You immediately recoil, turning your face away to avoid the intense, blinding rush of heavy heat. But as the thick steam completely envelops you, it brings with it an incredibly complex, deeply intoxicating, massively beautiful wave of atomized aromas. The intense, sharp heat has instantly, forcefully unlocked the volatile oils of the crushed wild mustard seeds and the sticky pine nut paste. The entire cave is instantly flooded with a deeply pungent, heavily earthy, beautifully spicy, incredibly wild perfume that smells vastly superior to any expensive, modern, artificially scented spa candle you have ever foolishly purchased. A mainstream historical fact is that this specific, ingenious method, widely known as stone boiling, was the absolute, undisputed, universal culinary standard for almost all ancient pre-pottery cultures entirely across the globe. From the freezing, wind-swept steppes of Ice Age Europe to the deeply forested, ancient coastlines of North America, indigenous populations successfully boiled heavy stews, rendered thick fats, and brewed complex medicinal teas completely without ever needing to invent a single piece of fireproof ceramic or metal cookware. It is a brilliant, highly effective, purely mechanical manipulation of profound thermal physics. You peer cautiously through the rapidly thinning, heavily swirling clouds of fragrant steam. The dark water inside the heavy wooden bowl is now violently, aggressively boiling. It is not just a gentle, lazy simmer. It is a chaotic, rolling, furious, heavily agitated boil. The massive, pale, heavy chunks of pure mammoth marrow, which only moments ago looked incredibly unappetizing and completely solid, are now melting with astonishing rapid speed. Under the intense, radiating heat of the submerged stone, the dense fat violently emulsifies, aggressively breaking down into a thick, highly glossy, deeply rich, golden oil that completely coats the turbulent surface of the dark water. The torn, rough pieces of the bitter mustard greens violently dance and rapidly churn in the rolling liquid, their vibrant, dark colours rapidly shifting to a soft, completely muted, highly cooked olive hue. It is a quirky little fringe tidbit of archaeology that scientists can always instantly, completely identify these specific ancient boiling stones when they carefully excavate ancient hearths, easily distinguishing them from ordinary, standard firing rocks. When you repeatedly subject a heavy, dense stone to the extreme, violent thermal shock of moving directly from 1,000-degree fire directly into freezing cold water, the intense, rapid contraction of the dense mineral matrix completely covers the outer surface of the rock with thousands of microscopic, highly distinct, incredibly complex, spiderweb-like fractures known as crazing. You can actually hear this violent microscopic destruction happening entirely right now, beneath the surface of the violently bubbling water. A low, incredibly fast, completely rhythmic ticking sound, tick, 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 heavily vibrates through the thick wooden walls of the bowl as the intense, heavy structure of the dense granite desperately struggles to hold itself completely together against the massive, overwhelming temperature shift. But a single, heavy rock is entirely insufficient to maintain this high-volume, furious boil for very long. The freezing water is aggressively, rapidly stealing the stone's trapped heat. You quickly, efficiently drop your makeshift wooden tongs, wiping your heavily sweating brow, and immediately rush right back to the roaring hearth. You grab a fresh pair of green oak branches, the first pair having completely, frustratingly burn through at the heavy tips and aggressively dive back into the glowing white-hot coals. You carefully, meticulously extract a second heavy, glowing red granite cobble, carrying it swiftly across the dusty floor and carefully lower it directly into the heavy wooden bowl. Another massive, deafening, violent eruption of thick, fragrant steam. You repeat this highly stressful, incredibly heavy, heavily focused dance 3 more times. Extract, carry, lower, explode, extract, carry, lower, explode. By the time the 5th massive glowing red stone is completely submerged in the heavy wooden trough, the entire volume of the thick dark liquid is in a state of absolute, sustained, furious, chaotic thermal upheaval. The liquid is practically jumping completely out of the heavy, bark-lined bowl. The rich, deeply savoury smell of the fully rendered mammoth marrow entirely dominates the rock shelter now. A deeply meaty, highly complex, incredibly comforting scent that makes your stomach loudly, violently rumble in eager anticipation. Now finally, it is the exact perfect moment for the star of the prehistoric show. You turn to the massive, tightly sinew-wrapped hide bundle resting heavily on the dusty floor, completely containing the prime, perfectly butchered cuts of the young, woolly mammoth bull you painstakingly harvested earlier this evening. You carefully peel back the thick, heavy leather flaps, exposing the deeply red, incredibly lean, beautifully marbled slabs of ancient muscle. These are tough working muscles, completely heavily packed with dense, highly fibrous connective tissue that would be completely, entirely unchewable if you simply tried to quickly sear them over an open flame like a modern, lazy backyard barbecue steak. They require exactly this: a long, deeply intense, highly aggressive, completely wet, sustained heat to slowly, beautifully break down the tough, unyielding collagen into soft, sticky, deeply luxurious gelatin. You carefully pick up a massive, heavy, 5-pound slab of the deeply red meat. It feels incredibly dense, deeply cold, and heavily substantial in your tired, aching hands. You step back over to the violently, aggressively boiling wooden bowl. You do not drop the heavy meat entirely from a height. You gently, carefully, smoothly slide it entirely down the rough, heavily textured inner wooden wall of the ancient pot, allowing it to slip entirely quietly into the furious, swirling, deeply golden broth. The absolute second the massive cold chunk of heavy meat completely enters the boiling water, the intensely chaotic, high-pitched, furious acoustic signature of the pot entirely, instantly changes. The loud, aggressive, highly agitated hissing and splashing is completely, instantly, heavily muted by the sudden massive introduction of the cold, dense mass. The rolling, furious boil almost completely stops for a single, long, incredibly quiet second before slowly, heavily returning as a deep, profound, lazy, incredibly thick, heavy simmer. Bloop, bloop, bloop. The heavy, thick liquid slowly begins to bubble lazily around the completely submerged edges of the massive, dark meat. Historians still argue whether these highly skilled, incredibly knowledgeable ancient populations completely treated these heavy, heavily stressed granite boiling stones as entirely disposable, single-use, highly temporary kitchen items, instantly, heavily discarding them the absolute moment they inevitably cracked and completely fell apart, or if they meticulously, carefully, repeatedly, heavily reheated the exact and heavily crazed stones over and over again, completely, night after night, until they literally, entirely, violently dissolved into completely useless, heavy piles of completely granular sand. Watching the intense, terrifying, completely violent thermal physics completely heavily play out inside your beautifully crafted, highly organic, wooden slow cooker, you strongly, deeply lean toward the single-use, disposable theory. It feels incredibly, deeply dangerous to heavily trust a heavily fractured, completely traumatized rock with a second massive 1,000-degree plunge. You stand back, heavily leaning against the cool, solid, deeply rough limestone wall of the cave, wiping the thick, heavy condensation completely from your face. The intense, highly stressful, heavy action of the initial boil is entirely, completely over. The massive, thick, heavy hunks of highly prized mammoth meat are completely, securely, fully submerged in a deeply rich, highly complex, deeply seasoned, wildly fragrant golden broth. The heavy, dark green mustard leaves lazily, beautifully float past the completely sunken, dark shapes of the heavy meat. The incredible, deeply satisfying, entirely magical, prehistoric kitchen trick has completely, flawlessly worked. But the heavily demanding, highly physical job of the Ice Age chef is absolutely not entirely finished. Bringing the massive, heavy pot to a furious boil was merely the highly dramatic, incredibly chaotic opening act. Now you completely face the long, slow, agonizingly patient, highly meticulous, ancient art of temperature maintenance. You must prepare to heavily, carefully tend this ancient bubbling cauldron entirely through the long, freezing, deeply dark Pleistocene night. You sink back down into the soft, deeply compacted dust of the cave floor, carefully pulling your heavy, uncured animal hide tightly up around your exhausted shoulders. The profound, heavy reality of the prehistoric night shift has officially, undeniably begun. Outside the massive, sweeping limestone mouth of the rock shelter, the brutal Pleistocene weather is aggressively deteriorating. The pale, bruised indigo of the evening sky has completely surrendered to a pitch-black, freezing void, and the wind has returned with a violent, howling vengeance, furiously whipping decrystalline snow directly across the dark mouth of the cave. But here, tucked safely inside this ancient, glowing pocket of human civilization, the atmosphere is incredibly, profoundly different. The radiating, superheated warmth of the central hearth fire entirely pushes back the lethal cold, and the thick air is completely saturated with the most glorious, deeply comforting, intensely savory aroma you have ever experienced in your entire life. You sit quietly, your heavy eyelids drooping slightly, watching the thick, dark liquid lazily bubble inside the miraculously sealed, beautifully carved wooden bowl. Back in your highly convenient, modern, vastly easier life, slow cooking a heavy winter stew involves aggressively tossing a few pre-chopped vegetables and a neatly plastic-wrapped slab of beef into a heavy ceramic appliance, lazily pressing a digital button, and literally walking completely away for 8 consecutive hours to binge-watch a heavily dramatized true crime documentary. You can completely abandon your modern kitchen, entirely confident that a tiny, invisible microchip will flawlessly, seamlessly regulate the exact temperature of your dinner while you comfortably nap on a plush, heavily upholstered sofa. Out here, however, there are absolutely no microchips, no perfectly calibrated heating coils, and definitely no soft, comfortable sofas. Your highly demanding, primitive slow cooker runs entirely exclusively on manual, back-breaking, utterly relentless physical labour. The heavy granite stones you carefully, violently plunged into the freezing water earlier are not magical, infinite batteries of thermal energy. They aggressively, rapidly transfer their massive, trapped heat directly into the freezing water, and within 20 short minutes, they become completely, entirely thermally exhausted. If you simply stop paying absolute focused attention and accidentally fall heavily asleep against the cold cave wall, the thick, fat-laden liquid will rapidly, aggressively cool down. The boiling will entirely cease, and your incredibly precious, highly prized mammoth meat will simply sit sadly in a pool of lukewarm, deeply unappetizing, greasy water, utterly ruining the massive, incredibly dangerous physical effort of the entire clan. You cannot sleep. You must constantly, meticulously, heavily tend the ancient machine. You pick up your clumsy, heavily charred green oak tongs. It is time to perform the very first, highly stressful extraction cycle of the long night. You lean closely over the steaming, intensely fragrant wooden trough, squinting heavily through the thick, swirling, beautifully aromatic vapour. You must carefully fish the exhausted, cooled stones completely out from the absolute bottom of the deeply opaque, heavily cluttered broth without accidentally pulling out a massive, highly valuable chunk of the cooking meat. You blindly, clumsily poke the thick wooden sticks completely into the dark, incredibly hot liquid, feeling around the rough, highly textured bottom of the wooden bowl until you firmly strike the solid, unmistakable, heavy curve of a sunken granite cobble. You aggressively grip the heavy rock with the slippery, completely fat-coated wooden sticks and slowly, agonizingly pull it completely up through the thick, murky depths. As it violently breaks the oily, highly golden surface of the heavy broth, it is completely, heavily coated in a thick, sticky layer of rendered mammoth fat, tiny clinging pieces of torn mustard greens, and the dark, deeply fragrant residue of the crushed pine nut paste. It is incredibly slippery, massively heavy, and highly dangerous to carefully maneuver. You awkwardly, heavily swing the completely thermally dead rock away from the wooden bowl and drop it somewhat unceremoniously near the glowing edge of the main hearth. It lands heavily with a dull, wet, deeply unspectacular thud, instantly sizzling softly as the rich, thick fat aggressively burns off its deeply cooled surface. You immediately drop the slippery wooden tongs and grab a fresh, completely dry pair of heavy oak branches. You violently thrust them straight back into the absolute hottest, deeply glowing red core of the roaring fire, desperately hunting for a brand new, freshly superheated, deeply pulsing granite replacement. The intense radiating heat aggressively sears the sensitive, highly vulnerable skin of your knuckles once again, a sharp, constant, deeply painful physical reminder of exactly what it truly costs to eat well in the Ice Age. You successfully extract a massive, cherry red, highly dangerous stone, carefully, nervously, waddling it across the dusty cave floor, and gently, smoothly lower it directly into the heavy wooden bowl. The violent, aggressive, heavily explosive hiss returns completely, instantly reviving the deep, rolling, furious boil of the savoury broth. You settle heavily back onto the dusty floor, gently rubbing your aggressively aching forearms. You are going to have to repeat this highly stressful, incredibly heavy, completely exhausting physical extraction and replacement cycle roughly every 20 to 30 minutes for the next several hours. A mainstream historical fact that completely contextualizes this staggering amount of heavy culinary labour is the sheer, unimaginable daily caloric requirement of a heavily active, fully grown Neanderthal desperately surviving a brutal Pleistocene winter. While a modern, average human might comfortably, easily survive on a standard diet of 2,000 calories a day, these ancient, heavily muscled, highly active hunters required anywhere from 4,000 to a staggering 6,000 completely nutrient-dense calories every single day, just to maintain their massive body mass and effectively, successfully generate enough internal, metabolic heat to physically survive the brutal, freezing nights. To them, this incredibly heavy, massively fatty, highly caloric mammoth stew is absolutely not a fun, light, weekend culinary project. It is a critical, deeply essential, incredibly massive refueling operation necessary for basic, fundamental biological survival. It completely effortlessly makes a modern lumberjack's incredibly heavy, massively towering stack of syrupy breakfast pancakes look like a light, entirely insignificant, incredibly sad little spa snack. As the slow, heavy, deeply dark hours of the frozen night painstakingly slowly creep by, the intense, chaotic atmosphere inside the cave beautifully settles into a highly rhythmic, deeply hypnotic, incredibly soothing routine. Fish out the cold stone, toss it aside, grab the hot stone, plunge it in, rest, repeat, The repetitive, highly manual labour slowly becomes entirely second nature, a quiet, heavily moving meditation entirely dictated by the strict, unforgiving laws of ancient thermal physics. You watch completely mesmerised as the massive, tough, incredibly deeply red blocks of raw mammoth muscle slowly, beautifully transform under the relentless, heavy, highly sustained wet heat. The aggressive, deeply rolling boil slowly, efficiently breaks down the tough, dense, unyielding collagen fibres, actively melting them completely into a deeply rich, highly luxurious, incredibly sticky gelatin that entirely fundamentally thickens the dark, golden broth into a heavy, glossy, deeply magnificent gravy. The incredibly complex, highly wild aroma entirely saturating the rock shelter is now absolutely, undeniably staggering. The deeply sharp, aggressively pungent, highly volatile oils of the crushed wild mustard seeds have beautifully mellowed, entirely perfectly marrying with the deep, heavily earthy, incredibly sweet notes of the thick pine nut paste. But the absolute, undisputed, entirely dominant scent is the profoundly rich, incredibly deeply savoury, highly complex smell of the rendered mammoth marrow and the slow-cooked, heavily broken down, prehistoric beef. It smells incredibly ancient, deeply comforting, and fundamentally, biologically perfect. Your stomach violently, loudly rumbles again, a deep, heavily echoing sound that entirely perfectly competes with the gentle, rhythmic, deeply lazy bloop, bloop, bloop of the heavy, simmering wooden pot. You occasionally carefully throw another handful of dry, beautifully fragrant spruce branches completely directly onto the central hearth fire, sending a massive, highly beautiful, completely chaotic shower of bright orange sparks violently dancing completely up toward the dark, jagged, totally soot-stained limestone ceiling of the cave. As you completely pull another heavily cooled, fat-smeared stone entirely out of the thick broth, you notice a massive amount of dark grey wood ash and microscopic, completely gritty rock dust heavily accumulating thick along the rough, completely heavily textured inner rim of the massive wooden bowl. This gritty, entirely unappetizing looking grey sludge is a completely unavoidable, highly natural byproduct of constantly, repeatedly dropping heavily charred, slightly fractured rocks completely directly from a massive wood fire straight into your dinner. It is a quirky little fringe tidbit of archaeology that this constant, entirely unintentional ingestion of fine wood ash and microscopic rock grit from heavy boiling stones actually provided these ancient, highly vulnerable populations with a massive, deeply crucial, incredibly essential daily dose of completely vital dietary minerals like heavy calcium and raw iron, which were incredibly, notoriously difficult to reliably source from a completely meat-heavy, entirely frozen winter landscape. You are essentially, completely accidentally making heavily fortified, incredibly, highly mineralized prehistoric vitamin stew. Historians still argue whether these highly skilled, deeply knowledgeable ancient cooks meticulously, carefully skimmed this thick, gritty, heavily ashy scum entirely off the calm surface of their boiling wooden pots, using carefully carved bone ladles in a desperate attempt to refine the heavy broth, or if they simply, pragmatically, stirred the dark, charcoal-heavy froth directly back into the highly caloric stew for added thickness and essential gritty texture. Given that modern, highly trendy wellness influencers absolutely currently charge a massive, highly offensive premium for completely tiny, entirely ridiculous bottles of dark green juice, heavily laced with literal activated charcoal, to supposedly magically detoxify your perfectly functioning liver, you decide to just completely ignore the thick grey ash heavily gathering at the highly textured edge of the bowl. You are just completely effortlessly ahead of the modern dietary curve. The heavy, incredibly deep, profound physical exhaustion of the long, freezing, highly active day finally begins to violently catch up with you. your heavy eyelids constantly, aggressively droop, heavily fighting a massive, highly losing battle against the intense, deeply radiating, entirely comforting warmth of the massive hearth fire and the deeply soothing, highly rhythmic bubbling of the thick stew. You constantly catch yourself heavily nodding off, your chin violently striking your thick, heavily fur-wrapped chest, only to violently jerk entirely awake again, completely terrified that you have accidentally allowed the precious, heavily magnificent mammoth broth to completely go entirely, utterly cold. You heavily, deeply struggle to completely stay entirely, perfectly awake, endlessly rotating the ancient, glowing red stones through the long, freezing Pleistocene night. You jerk entirely awake, your chin completely snapping up from your heavily fur-wrapped chest. The intense, violent exhaustion of the frozen night had finally, successfully, pulled you under for a few short, highly confused minutes. You blink aggressively against the dim, flickering orange light of the dying hearth, momentarily, completely forgetting that you are heavily entrenched in a Pleistocene cave, and not just comfortably dozing on your incredibly soft modern microfiber couch during a particularly boring Sunday afternoon documentary. You quickly, nervously, look completely over at the heavy wooden cooking bowl. It has not gone cold. In fact, while you were briefly, entirely unconscious, the intense, sustained wet heat of the final glowing granite cobble you heavily plunged into the dark water has completely, flawlessly finished its profound culinary work. The chaotic, furiously rolling boil has beautifully, perfectly subsided into a thick, heavily lazy, incredibly slow simmer. The heavy dark liquid has violently reduced by at least a third of its original massive volume, completely concentrating the wild, deeply complex flavours into a profound, highly glossy, impossibly rich gravy. The massive tough chunks of dark mammoth muscle are no longer entirely rigid blocks of prehistoric protein. They are heavily slumped, beautifully softened, and completely yielding in the golden broth. The intense, highly aromatic smell filling the rock shelter is now absolutely, undeniably intoxicating. It is the deep, incredibly heavy scent of pure, unadulterated, culinary victory. Your stomach violently, loudly rumbles, a heavy, echoing demand that completely ignores the extreme, late hour of the freezing night. It is officially, finally, time to completely transition from an exhausted, highly stressed ancient cook into humanity's very first, incredibly eager, prehistoric foodie. You desperately, profoundly need to taste this masterpiece. But you absolutely cannot simply plunge your entirely unwashed, heavily soot-stained, completely freezing fingers directly into a massive bubbling cauldron of 1,000-degree mammoth fat and expect a positive, highly enjoyable outcome. Back in your highly convenient modern life, if you desperately needed to aggressively sample a hot soup, you would lazily pull out a perfectly stamped, mass-produced stainless steel spoon from a completely overflowing kitchen drawer. Or worse, use one of those incredibly flimsy, completely useless, white plastic spoons you get with cheap takeout that instantly, violently melts the absolute second it completely touches hot broth. Out here, the concept of a single-use, disposable eating utensil is absolutely, entirely laughable. Every single object requires massive, heavy, intense physical labour to successfully create, meaning their eating tools are incredibly, beautifully durable and highly sophisticated. The older Neanderthal woman, the one with the beautifully polished cave bear tooth necklace, who gracefully taught you the violent, heavy art of completely shattering mammoth femurs, silently, completely notices your intense, highly desperate, heavily hungry gaze deeply locked onto the bubbling wooden pot. She smiles warmly, reaching deeply into a soft leather pouch hanging closely at her waist. She pulls out two completely distinct, incredibly beautiful, highly functional objects and gently, gracefully hands them directly to you. You hold the first object carefully up to the flickering orange firelight. It is a deeply simple, yet brilliantly, completely, flawlessly engineered piece of highly organic origami. It is a wide, shallow ladle, completely meticulously folded from a single, thick, deeply papery sheet of pristine white birch bark. The ancient maker intricately, heavily scored the tough bark, elegantly folding the corners tightly inward to instantly create a deep, highly functional liquid basin, and then completely, securely pinned the complex folds tightly together using a single, sharp, incredibly thin thorn from a wild hawthorn bush. It is entirely lightweight, completely waterproof, and deeply, intensely beautiful in its raw, highly functional simplicity. It completely effortlessly puts your clumsy, highly frustrating attempt at folding a simple paper airplane to absolute, entirely embarrassing shame. But it is the second object she completely gently hands you that instantly, entirely takes your exhausted breath away. You are holding a completely solid, heavily carved, beautifully polished spoon, meticulously crafted entirely from a single, thick piece of aged reindeer antler. The sheer, highly intricate craftsmanship, completely visible in the dim, flickering light, is absolutely, undeniably staggering. The deep bowl of the ancient spoon is perfectly, smoothly scooped, deeply hollowed out to flawlessly, effortlessly hold a heavy, generous portion of hot, thick liquid. The long, gently curving handle is intricately, heavily decorated with a complex, completely rhythmic series of deeply engraved, perfectly parallel, highly geometric lines. A mainstream historical fact that completely shatters the deeply persistent, highly inaccurate modern myth of cavemen simply tearing raw meat apart with their bare, unwashed hands is the staggering, entirely undeniable sophistication of upper and middle Paleolithic bone and antler carving. These ancient populations absolutely possessed highly specialized, deeply complex toolkits, completely dedicated entirely to fine, highly detailed woodworking and delicate bone carving. Using nothing but tiny, incredibly sharp flint burins, which essentially functioned exactly like incredibly precise ancient chisels, they meticulously, painstakingly shaved away the tough, unyielding antler, millimetre by highly agonizing millimetre. They then spent countless, deeply exhausting hours heavily aggressively rubbing the rough, deeply carved bone against wet, abrasive sandstone, entirely completely polishing it into a smooth, deeply comfortable, heavily refined utensil that functionally and aesthetically completely rivals any expensive, modern, artisanal wooden spoon you could heavily overpay for at a trendy weekend farmer's market. Still argue whether these intricately decorated, highly polished eating utensils were simply everyday, deeply utilitarian household items casually used by absolutely everyone in the clan for every single heavy meal, or if they were carefully guarded, deeply personal, heavily prized heirlooms meant to visually, completely signify a specific individual's elevated, highly respected status within the complex social hierarchy of the tribe. Looking at the sheer, staggering amount of incredibly patient, highly skilled labour completely required to successfully manufacture just this one single spoon, you heavily, deeply suspect it was a deeply treasured, highly personal possession, arguably the ancient prehistoric equivalent of carrying around a massively expensive, highly exclusive designer handbag, but infinitely more completely functional. You completely, carefully examine the smooth, highly polished edge of the spoon's deep basin. It is slightly, completely, unevenly, worn down completely on one specific side, heavily bearing the microscopic, deeply ingrained physical record of countless heavy meals violently scraped completely from the highly textured bottom of rough wooden bowls. This reveals a quirky little fringe tidbit of archaeology. Scientists heavily utilizing deeply powerful, highly advanced microscopic analysis on the specific heavily worn edges of these ancient, intricately carved spoons can actually perfectly, completely, consistently determine whether the original ancient user was right-handed or completely left-handed. The specific highly angled pattern of the deep abrasive wear and tear entirely completely proves that the overarching, deeply biological ratio of right-handedness to left-handedness in ancient human populations has remained completely, incredibly stubbornly consistent for tens of thousands of deeply evolutionary years. You are holding the profoundly intimate, highly physical echo of a specific ancient right-handed person's highly repetitive daily dining habits. You take a deep, slow, heavily steadying breath. It is entirely, finally time to completely utilize this prehistoric masterpiece. You gently, carefully grip the intricately carved, highly polished reindeer antler handle, completely dipping the smooth, deep bowl of the ancient spoon directly into the dark, heavily bubbling, incredibly glossy mammoth stew. You completely bypass the massive heavy chunks of dark muscle, entirely deliberately seeking out the deep, rich, completely highly emulsified golden broth, completely making sure to heavily scoop up a tiny torn fragment of the dark green mustard leaf and a tiny, heavily sticky speck of the crushed pine nut paste. Bring it heavily, completely close to your mouth. The thick, incredibly rich liquid violently steams in the freezing air of the cave. You bring it heavily, completely close to your face, blowing softly, deeply, and continuously across the highly glossy, intensely fragrant surface. You absolutely know from deeply painful, highly personal modern experience that aggressively, entirely, completely burning the delicate, highly sensitive roof of your mouth on a spoonful of violently hot, heavily fat-laden soup is a completely universal, highly terrible human experience that entirely instantly ruins the next 3 days of your culinary life. You want to completely, entirely avoid making that highly rookie, intensely painful mistake in front of your highly competent, deeply experienced prehistoric hosts. When the heavy, thick steam finally perfectly subsides to a gentle wispy wisp, you slowly, deliberately, completely place the incredibly smooth, ancient bone spoon directly into your mouth. The intense, profound explosion of highly complex, entirely wild flavour is absolutely, undeniably immediate and completely, overwhelmingly staggering. The absolute first thing that violently heavily hits your deeply exhausted palate is the insanely rich, profoundly heavy, incredibly luxurious mouthfeel of the completely rendered mammoth marrow. It is thick, deeply coating, entirely highly glossy, and intensely heavily savoury. It completely, flawlessly, perfectly mimics the absolute best, most highly expensive, aggressively simmered modern bone broths, but it possesses a deeply earthy, incredibly wild, highly complex depth that absolutely simply does not exist anywhere in the completely heavily sanitized, intensely domesticated 21st century. But it is absolutely not just heavy, greasy fat. Instantly, completely cutting perfectly through that dense, heavy richness is the sharp, highly aggressive, deeply pungent, perfectly peppery bite of the wild mustard seeds you so completely, painstakingly crushed on the heavy slate slab. It provides a massive, incredibly beautiful, deeply essential high note that entirely completely, perfectly balances the heavy, thick base of the ancient fat. Then, slowly, heavily, unfurling completely on the very back of your tongue, comes the deeply sweet, incredibly resinous, heavily earthy, perfectly complex flavour of the heavily mashed pine nut paste, entirely completely rounding out the massive, heavy, prehistoric bite with a profoundly beautiful, entirely wild finish. You slowly, heavily, entirely close your eyes, completely deeply savouring the magnificent, highly complex warmth as the heavy, rich broth completely, slowly, heavily travels entirely down your freezing, exhausted throat. It is, without a single, entirely absolute doubt, the most profoundly, highly intensely satisfying, completely glorious thing you have ever tasted in your entire life. If you could somehow miraculously open a highly trendy, dimly lit, deeply expensive restaurant right now and simply serve this exact, highly ancient, deeply authentic broth, you would instantly, entirely effortlessly win every single highly coveted culinary award on the entire modern planet. You would have lines heavily stretching completely around the entire block, completely filled with highly eager, incredibly annoying modern foodies, entirely desperate to heavily violently post a blurry picture of your ancient mammoth stew completely onto their highly curated social media feeds. You completely, slowly open your eyes, entirely deeply exhaling a long, completely, heavily satisfied breath of thick, highly fragrant steam. You look entirely, completely over at the older Neanderthal woman. She is completely, quietly, deeply watching you. A highly soft, entirely deeply knowing, entirely deeply amused smile, completely playing heavily across her lined, highly deeply weathered face. She completely, entirely, perfectly understands the massive, highly profound, completely universal language of a deeply excellent, heavily hard-won meal. The massive, highly dangerous, incredibly heavy, physical labour was completely, absolutely, undeniably, entirely, completely worth it. You carefully, gently, completely tap the incredibly, beautifully carved, highly polished reindeer antler spoon, entirely, completely, against the thick, highly textured birch bark rim of the heavy wooden basin. The complex, highly wild, deeply seasoned mammoth broth is entirely, absolutely, flawlessly, completely perfect. The massive, deeply dense, incredibly tough prehistoric meat is finally entirely perfectly tender. You slowly, heavily, entirely turn entirely around, completely, deeply looking out across the dimly lit, highly smoky, entirely heavily warm expanse of the limestone cave. The incredibly long, highly brutal, deeply freezing night is finally, entirely, slowly, completely giving way to the massive, highly essential, entirely deeply communal climax of the Ice Age day. The prehistoric kitchen has completely, flawlessly, entirely delivered its heavy miracle. Now it is absolutely finally time to completely, entirely heavily wake the massive exhausted clan and entirely completely prepare to deeply, entirely share the massive, heavily hard-won feast. You carefully rest the beautifully polished reindeer antler spoon against the thick, textured bark rim of the heavy wooden basin. The incredibly rich, deeply savoury aroma of the heavily reduced mammoth stew has absolutely, completely permeated every single microscopic corner of the vast limestone rock shelter. It is a thick, highly intoxicating perfume of rendered fat, sharp wild mustard, and deeply roasted pine nuts that serves as the world's most effective, universally understood alarm clock. You do not need to aggressively bang a heavy stick against a hollow log or loudly yell to wake the exhausted hunting party. The profound, deeply instinctual smell of highly caloric, perfectly cooked food does all the heavy lifting for you. Slowly from the deep, heavily shadowed recesses of the warm cave, the massive, fur-wrapped shapes of the sleeping clan begin to gently, quietly stir. There is a highly relatable, deeply human universality to the slow, groggy process of waking up to the smell of a massive, comforting meal. You watch as the heavy, highly muscular hunters rub the sleep entirely from their eyes, stretching their thick, heavily bruised limbs with long, deeply resonant groans that echo softly off the jagged ceiling. Back in your modern, highly accelerated life, getting your extended family completely organised and happily seated for a massive holiday dinner usually involves frantically screaming over a blaring television, aggressively coordinating 3 different highly conflicting dietary restrictions, and desperately trying to keep the family dog from inhaling a dropped dinner roll. Here, the transition from deep, exhausting sleep to eager, highly focused communal dining is incredibly peaceful, completely seamless, and deeply, beautifully quiet. They slowly, heavily migrate toward the warm, glowing light of the central hearth, their dark eyes locked entirely onto the steaming, bubbling wooden pot, with an expression of profound, deeply reverent anticipation. The older woman with the polished cave bear tooth necklace completely takes charge of the highly important, deeply critical serving process. She utilizes several massive, beautifully folded birch bark ladles, expertly dipping them deeply into the thick, dark golden liquid. She ensures that every single heavy, intricately carved wooden bowl is completely, generously filled with massive, tender chunks of the slow-cooked mammoth muscle, heavily submerged in the deeply glossy, highly gelatinous marrow broth. Historians still argue whether these massive, deeply essential, prehistoric communal feasts were entirely egalitarian, free-for-all buffets where everyone simply violently grabbed whatever they could physically reach, or if the deeply vital, highly caloric food was strictly, heavily portioned out, based on a rigid, deeply respected social hierarchy within the ancient tribe. Watching the incredibly deliberate, highly respectful, deeply systematic way the older woman carefully distributes the heavy bowls, ensuring the youngest children and the oldest, deeply weathered elders are served first before the massive, heavily muscled hunters take their own massive portions. You strongly lean toward a society built entirely on profound, highly structured mutual care, rather than chaotic, selfish brute force. You accept your own heavy, beautifully carved wooden bowl with both of your cold, highly calloused hands. The intense, deeply radiating heat of the thick broth instantly warms your freezing, stiff fingers directly through the thick textured wood. You carefully, slowly carry your massive portion back to your quiet, comfortable spot near the perimeter of the fire, sinking heavily down into the soft, dusty earth. The entire clan is quietly seated in a massive, deeply intimate, highly connected circle around the roaring, deeply comforting flames. For a long, profound, intensely quiet moment, the only sound completely audible in the entire rock shelter is the soft, heavy, highly rhythmic sound of blowing, sipping, and deep, profoundly satisfied chewing. A mainstream historical fact that completely redefines this simple, beautiful act of sitting around a fire eating hot soup is that communal food sharing is widely considered by evolutionary anthropologists to be the absolute, undisputed primary driver of advanced human social development and complex language. When our ancient ancestors finally stopped simply foraging individually and hiding their raw food in trees like highly antisocial, deeply paranoid chimpanzees, and instead completely began to systematically bring massive, heavily hunted resources back to a central glowing hearth to intentionally cook and equally share, it fundamentally, entirely altered the trajectory of our entire species. The safety of the fire, the massive influx of heavily digestible calories from the cooked meat, and the deeply required, highly complex social negotiation of completely sharing a single, massive kill literally provided the essential biological fuel and the deeply necessary social environment to rapidly, aggressively evolve our massively oversized, highly complex human brains. You are not just simply eating a bowl of thick stew right now, you are actively, deeply participating in the exact, specific, highly fundamental behavioral catalyst that completely created modern humanity. You take a massive, heavy bite of the dark mammoth meat. Because it has been aggressively, heavily slow cooked in the violently boiling, heavily fat-laden water for hours, the incredibly tough, highly fibrous, dense muscle has completely, entirely surrendered. It beautifully melts completely apart on your tongue, entirely saturated with the deep, wild, highly pungent flavours of the crushed mustard seeds and the deeply earthy pine nuts. The incredibly rich, heavily reduced marrow acts like a deeply luxurious, entirely velvety gravy, completely coating your throat and instantly sending a massive, highly potent wave of pure, heavy, deeply warming energy, completely radiating entirely throughout your exhausted, freezing body. It is completely, undeniably flawless. You honestly heavily consider asking the lead hunter for the recipe, but you quickly realise that step 1, risk your absolute life repeatedly stabbing a 3-ton woolly rhinoceros with a sharp rock might be slightly too heavily complicated for your modern, highly convenient weekend meal prep routine. As the heavy, incredibly dense, highly caloric mammoth stew begins to completely fill their empty, deeply aching stomachs, the incredibly focused, heavy silence of the cave completely slowly begins to lift. The intense, highly stressful, heavy burden of Ice Age survival has been temporarily, miraculously, entirely lifted from their broad, heavy shoulders. The mood around the deeply glowing hearth entirely visibly shifts from a tense, hungry, highly focused desperation to a deeply relaxed, highly jovial, incredibly comfortable, communal warmth. The heavy, muscular hunters completely, slowly lean heavily back against the rough, dusty limestone walls, deeply, profoundly satisfied, gently patting their full, heavily expanded stomachs with thick, deeply calloused hands. The low, beautiful, highly rhythmic murmurs of ancient, deeply complex conversation entirely slowly begin to naturally, completely fill the smoky, warm air. You cannot completely understand a single, heavily guttural, deeply resonant syllable of their highly complex, beautifully ancient language, but you entirely perfectly recognize the absolute, universal human cadence of the sounds. They are highly animatedly recounting the incredibly dangerous, terrifyingly close calls of the afternoon's massive mammoth hunt. The lead hunter completely stands up, highly enthusiastically pantomiming the massive, violent, heavy swing of the young bull's terrifying tusks, deeply exaggerating his own graceful, highly narrow escape. The entire clan completely erupts into deep, heavy, profoundly chesty laughter. It is a deeply beautiful, highly universal, entirely familiar scene. You realise with a deep, profound smile that heavily exaggerating the specific, highly dramatic details of a wild fishing trip or a highly stressful workday to completely impress your deeply amused family is an absolute fundamental human tradition that stretches completely seamlessly back across 50,000 years of freezing, brutal history. The incredibly heavy, deeply satisfying meal slowly, gracefully, entirely winds down. The massive, beautiful wooden bowls are meticulously scraped clean of every single precious, highly valuable drop of the rich, heavily golden fat. The older woman with the highly polished cave bear necklace entirely gently gathers the completely empty bowls, carefully setting them deeply aside to be meticulously cleaned later with abrasive river sand and cold water. The intensely roaring, deeply bright central fire completely, slowly, heavily burns down to a massive, incredibly thick, deeply glowing bed of bright cherry red coals, entirely casting highly soft, deeply dancing, completely beautiful orange and red shadows entirely across the ancient, deeply watchful faces of the relaxed, highly comfortable clan. It is in this deeply quiet, incredibly peaceful, highly satiated after-dinner glow that the true, absolute, deeply profound magic of the ancient hearth completely, entirely reveals itself. A younger hunter, sitting deeply cross-legged in the soft, thick dust right next to you, entirely quietly reaches into a small, beautifully woven grass pouch tightly secured to his heavy leather belt. He completely, gently, highly carefully extracts a small, pale, highly delicate, incredibly fascinating object. It is a completely hollowed out, deeply, beautifully polished segment of a massive ancient bird bone, specifically the thick radius bone of a giant prehistoric griffon vulture. The bone has been completely, meticulously, entirely pierced with three perfectly aligned, highly circular holes entirely down its smooth, pale length. This is a quirky, little fringe tidbit of archaeology that completely, entirely, heavily shatters the deeply persistent, highly unfair, modern illusion of completely uncultured, deeply brutish ancient hominids. You are deeply, completely looking at a fully functional, highly complex, entirely meticulously crafted prehistoric musical instrument. Scientists heavily carefully excavating ancient, deeply buried Neanderthal and early human campsites have completely discovered these beautiful, highly delicate bone flutes, flawlessly entirely hidden among the heavy, discarded animal bones and highly sharp stone tools. They are completely, explicitly, perfectly tuned to entirely accurately play the exact precise notes of the deeply familiar, highly universal pentatonic scale, the exact same fundamental, deeply mathematical, musical foundation that entirely supports almost all modern, highly popular folk music and heavily, deeply beautiful blues songs. They were completely, entirely, absolutely making complex, highly structured, deeply emotional art. The young man entirely gently, completely carefully raises the highly polished, ancient vulture bone completely to his full, heavily bearded lips. He entirely, completely takes a slow, deeply, heavily steadying breath and entirely, gently, heavily blows. The incredibly soft, highly haunting, deeply beautiful, entirely clear musical note completely, entirely, instantly pierces the quiet, smoky, heavy air of the cave. It is a deeply sweet, highly melancholic, entirely purely magical sound that completely, entirely, flawlessly, heavily, perfectly echoes entirely off the jagged, heavy limestone ceiling. He completely, slowly, entirely moves his thick, heavily calloused fingers entirely, completely over the perfectly drilled holes, entirely gracefully, entirely playing a slow, deeply hypnotic, completely beautiful, highly rhythmic ancient melody. The entire clan completely, entirely, completely, deeply falls into a profound, highly, heavily reverent, completely magical silence. The incredibly sweet, highly piercing notes of the ancient bone flute completely, heavily, seamlessly, entirely intertwine, entirely perfectly, with the soft, highly rhythmic, completely gentle popping and deeply comforting crackling of the glowing red hearth coals. Outside the massive, heavily protective mouth of the deep, safe rock shelter, the brutal, incredibly violent, completely freezing Pleistocene wind entirely continues to furiously, violently, heavily howl completely across the dark, icy, unforgiving tundra. But completely, entirely in here, deeply, heavily surrounded by the profoundly full bellies, the heavily radiating, deeply ancient warmth, and the completely magical, incredibly highly beautiful, entirely haunting music of your ancient, deeply profound ancestors. You have absolutely, completely, entirely never felt more profoundly, highly, deeply, completely at home. The feast is entirely, completely, heavily concluded, but the deeply long, highly, deeply beautiful Ice Age night is entirely, completely, heavily, beautifully, still entirely young. The haunting, deeply beautiful notes of the ancient vulture bone flute completely, slowly fade into the smoky, heavily warm air of the rock shelter, entirely replaced once again by the deeply familiar, highly comforting, soft, rhythmic crackle of the glowing central hearth. Your stomach is completely, profoundly full, heavily packed with the incredibly rich, deeply savoury, highly caloric mammoth stew. Your heavy eyelids are aggressively, violently drooping. your entire exhausted body desperately begging to completely surrender to a long, deep, highly restorative Pleistocene sleep. But as you gaze completely across the dusty, dimly lit floor of the cave, reality heavily, entirely sets in. Resting securely against the far, shadowed limestone wall are the massive, thick, incredibly heavy, sinew-wrapped hide bundles, completely containing the vast, overwhelming majority of the raw meat you painstakingly butchered down in the snowy valley. Back in your modern, highly convenient, fiercely temperature-controlled life, dealing entirely with dinner leftovers usually involves standing bathed in the harsh, completely unflattering fluorescent light of an open refrigerator, aggressively trying to mathematically calculate exactly which oddly shaped, deeply stained plastic Tupperware container will successfully hold half a portion of cold, uninspiring lasagna without violently spilling completely over the sides. Out here in the brutal, freezing reality of the Ice Age, your leftover problem is scaled up to an absolutely terrifying, magnificent extreme. You have roughly 2,000 pounds of premium, highly attractive, deeply fragrant raw mammoth muscle sitting completely unprotected in the middle of a deeply hostile, incredibly hungry, frozen wilderness. You absolutely cannot simply leave it sitting casually in the corner of the warm cave. The intense radiating heat of the hearth fire would rapidly, aggressively spoil it, and the incredibly strong, deeply pungent scent of the raw meat would rapidly act as a massive, highly irresistible dinner bell for every single massive cave lion, desperate dire wolf, and towering, terrifying short-faced bear within a 50-mile frozen radius. You must entirely heavily secure the massive bounty. The older, highly experienced Neanderthal hunters completely, entirely understand this deeply critical, highly urgent necessity. They do not simply casually lie down to sleep. With slow, deeply heavy, highly exhausted groans, they entirely reluctantly push themselves entirely away from the deeply comforting, heavily radiating warmth of the dying fire. You deeply, profoundly sigh, tightly pulling your thick, heavily uncured animal hide securely back up around your cold ears. The long, incredibly physically demanding Ice Age day is absolutely, entirely not over yet. You must completely leave the safe, warm, deeply secure sanctuary of the kitchen and step heavily right back out into the violent, howling, utterly freezing black void of the prehistoric night to completely invent the ancient, deeply brilliant concept of long-term frozen food storage. You step completely past the massive, sweeping rock overhang, the intense, aggressively biting wind, instantly, violently, stinging your warm cheeks and completely, heavily snatching the thick white plumes of your exhausted breath right out of the dark air. You heavily grab the thick, rough, incredibly abrasive sinew, dragging straps of one of the massive, 90-pound bundles of raw mammoth meat, heavily leaning your entire aching, profoundly exhausted body weight completely forward to forcefully drag it through the deep, freshly blown, heavily squeaking snow. The clan is moving completely, silently, entirely, efficiently, heavily dragging the massive, highly valuable food cache completely away from the immediate living area of the cave to deliberately, completely minimize the highly dangerous, entirely terrifying threat of attracting massive, hungry apex predators directly to their beds. A mainstream historical fact that completely, entirely defined humanity's absolute ability to successfully, completely survive the brutal, unforgiving extremes of the Pleistocene epoch is the profound, incredibly reliable, deeply massive nature of permafrost. The Earth itself, completely frozen, entirely solid just a few short, highly rigid inches beneath the powdery topsoil, acts as a massive, entirely zero-energy, completely flawless deep freeze refrigerator. This entirely permanent, deeply unyielding layer of frozen Earth successfully preserves complex organic matter so incredibly, entirely flawlessly, that modern, highly astounded paleontologists entirely routinely uncover massive, deeply buried extinct megafauna that still completely seamlessly possess perfectly intact, heavily hydrated muscle tissue, fully preserved internal organs, and deeply intact, perfectly recognizable stomach contents. Tens of thousands of deeply long years after the massive animals initially heavily died. The Neanderthals you are walking completely silently with right now are entirely, deeply, intimately aware of this magnificent, highly consistent geologic feature, and they are about to heavily, completely utilize it to completely, flawlessly secure their entire winter survival. You heavily follow the lead hunter down a shallow, wind-swept embankment, completely, entirely away from the deeply comforting, highly visible orange glow of the distant cave fire. He completely, slowly stops at the incredibly flat, entirely frozen edge of a massive, deeply shallow, highly quiet peat bog. The dark, thick ice is completely, heavily swept entirely clear of snow by the violent, highly aggressive valley winds. He entirely drops his heavy hide bundle and heavily, completely kneels down on the intensely freezing, dark surface. He utilizes the heavy, completely blunt end of his incredibly thick, deeply solid thrusting spear to aggressively, violently, repeatedly strike the completely solid ice. Thwack, thwack, crack. The sharp, incredibly percussive, highly satisfying sound completely, loudly echoes across the deeply dark, entirely frozen, highly empty landscape. With a massive, final, incredibly heavy thrust, the thick ice violently, heavily shatters, completely exposing the deeply dark, incredibly thick, highly freezing, entirely muddy water, entirely hidden safely beneath. It is a quirky little fringe tidbit of biological archaeology that completely, entirely changes the modern, heavily preconceived notion of ancient simple food storage. Early, highly intelligent ancient hunters absolutely didn't just lazily, casually bury their massive meat caches in dry, completely superficial snowbanks, where highly aggressive, deeply hungry wolves could easily, entirely quickly dig it right back up. They deliberately, highly specifically anchored their massive, heavy bundles of raw muscle deep beneath the icy, highly muddy surface of freezing, entirely highly oxygen-starved ponds and ancient bogs. This entirely unique, incredibly specific, deeply brilliant ancient environment heavily, completely prevented dangerous aerobic decay and actively, heavily promoted the rapid, highly beneficial growth of specialized lactobacilli bacteria. They were essentially safely, heavily fermenting the raw mammoth meat into a massive, deeply sour, incredibly dense, highly preserved prehistoric salami. It entirely, completely, flawlessly puts your highly trendy, incredibly expensive, ridiculously heavily curated modern artisanal charcuterie board, the one with the tiny, deeply sad little spoonful of fancy fig jam, completely to absolute highly embarrassing shame, completely shattered hole in the dark, completely shattered hole in the dark, freezing ice. You violently, heavily heave the massive packages entirely directly into the thick, freezing, highly muddy bog water. They sink entirely slowly, heavily bubbling, completely gracefully displacing the deeply dark, entirely icy liquid. But they do not completely sink completely, entirely to the absolute bottom on their own. The thick, heavily trapped air inside the wrapped hide bundles makes them incredibly, highly frustratingly buoyant. To completely, flawlessly solve this highly annoying, deeply physical problem, the older, entirely silent hunters heavily quickly gather massive, incredibly heavy, entirely solid granite river boulders from the entirely frozen shoreline. They deeply, entirely, carefully, heavily, seamlessly stack these massive, freezing rocks completely, directly on top of the heavily submerged meat bundles, completely pinning them entirely, perfectly, securely down to the deeply dark, highly muddy, entirely oxygen-free bottom of the ancient freezing bog. You plunge your completely heavy, highly exhausted, heavily aching bare hands directly entirely into the violently freezing dark water to successfully help guide a massive, heavy boulder entirely perfectly completely into its deeply proper, highly secure place. The intense, completely violent cold instantly, heavily violently, bites entirely straight through your warm skin, immediately completely turning your thick, tired fingers completely, entirely numb and deeply, profoundly useless. You quickly, aggressively, deeply yank your entirely freezing hands completely directly back out of the deeply dark, completely icy water, frantically, heavily, entirely rubbing them completely, vigorously together to violently, quickly restore the entirely deeply necessary, highly vital flow of warm blood. You deeply, honestly, cannot even completely fathom the intense, highly profound level of deep, heavy physical endurance required to successfully, constantly, deeply submerge your entire bare limbs completely, directly into a violently freezing, ancient ice bog, just to put your heavy leftovers completely securely away for the night. You will absolutely, completely, never entirely complain about having to heavily, quickly rearrange the highly crowded, entirely slightly chilly bottom shelf of your modern refrigerator ever completely, entirely again. Historians still argue whether these highly skilled, entirely intelligent early human populations actively, entirely, completely managed these massive, deeply frozen meat caches exclusively for their own highly localized, deeply immediate, entirely insular winter survival, or if they profoundly, entirely heavily functioned as highly organized, widely recognized, deeply communal food banks specifically, entirely completely meant to successfully sustain massive, highly complex, entirely unprecedented gatherings of completely different, highly dispersed nomadic tribes during the brutally scarce, utterly heavily, entirely unforgiving months of the early spring thaw. Looking entirely deeply down at the massive, completely, heavily secured, entirely hidden bounty of pure, highly caloric energy, now resting deeply, entirely, completely, safely beneath the completely freezing, highly solid ice, you completely, profoundly realize the sheer, heavily staggering, entirely undeniable wealth it completely represents. In this deeply freezing, completely brutal ancient economy, this highly hidden, entirely fermented, deeply frozen bog is entirely, completely, absolutely, the ultimate, deeply secure, incredibly massive savings account. You heavily, entirely help the hunters deliberately, completely pack thick, deeply heavy chunks of the broken, heavily shattered ice completely, directly back over the dark hole, entirely seamlessly, heavily covering it completely with massive, thick heaps of deep, powdery snow to entirely flawlessly disguise the heavily valuable cache from the sharp, deeply highly sensitive noses of wandering, highly dangerous prehistoric scavengers. The completely intense, highly physically demanding, deeply completely exhausting manual labour of the Ice Age kitchen is completely, absolutely, entirely, finally over. The massive, deeply heavy, highly dangerous hunt was entirely, completely successful. The incredibly complex, deeply savoury, highly massive communal meal was entirely perfectly, entirely cooked, and deeply beautifully completely shared. And now, the massive, highly essential, entirely vital leftovers are completely, heavily, entirely, safely, perfectly secured deep, entirely, completely within the heavy, deeply unyielding, completely freezing grip of the absolute, entirely permanent permafrost. You completely, slowly, entirely, heavily stand entirely, completely back up your heavy, highly exhausted knees, violently, loudly popping, entirely, perfectly, completely in the deep, intense, profound silence of the deeply dark, utterly freezing, prehistoric night. The violently aggressive, howling wind entirely, heavily, completely sweeps entirely across the vast, deeply empty, completely frozen tundra, entirely erasing your deeply heavy, completely squeaking footsteps, almost completely, entirely instantly, as you finally entirely deeply, heavily turn, entirely back, completely toward the safe, warm, deeply, entirely, highly comforting orange glow of the distant limestone cave. You entirely, profoundly, completely realize that occasionally, heavily, mysteriously finding a completely heavily freezer burned, entirely, highly unrecognizable, deeply sad, frozen pizza box, completely, safely, entirely, buried, entirely, deeply, in the dark, highly, entirely, forgotten. Back of your modern kitchen freezer, absolutely, entirely pales, completely, entirely, in deep, highly profound comparison, entirely to the absolutely massive, incredibly intense, highly, deeply satisfying reality of successfully, entirely, completely hiding half of a 3-ton woolly mammoth entirely safely in a deeply freezing, completely dark, ancient bog. You entirely, deeply, slowly, heavily, entirely walk, completely directly back, completely toward the deeply, heavily roaring, entirely warm, completely, deeply magnificent, prehistoric hearth, entirely, completely, profoundly ready to entirely, finally, entirely, absolutely, deeply surrender, completely, entirely to the absolutely, most incredibly, highly, deeply satisfying, completely, profoundly heavy, entirely, flawlessly well-earned sleep of your entire, completely, undeniably, deeply modern life. You heavily, slowly drag your exhausted, profoundly aching body back through the thick, heavily squeaking snow, leaving the dark, entirely frozen, highly secure bog completely behind you. The intensely violent, deeply aggressive Pleistocene wind furiously whips completely across the vast open tundra, violently throwing sharp, crystalline shards of dry ice directly against your completely numb cheeks. Every single heavy step you forcefully take toward the distant, deeply inviting orange glow of the limestone rock shelter feels like navigating entirely through waist-deep, freezing wet cement. The massive, incredibly heavy, physical exertion of the completely long, brutal Ice Age day has entirely, completely drained every single microscopic drop of raw kinetic energy from your weary muscles. You are absolutely, entirely running entirely socially on the deeply primal, highly potent fumes of that incredibly rich, deeply fatty mammoth stew you happily consumed earlier. When you finally, completely heavily step entirely back, completely over the dry, dusty threshold of the massive cave, the physical relief is incredibly, profoundly, instantaneous, and deeply, heavily overwhelming. The violent, shrieking howl of the freezing night wind is entirely, immediately, heavily muted, completely replaced by the beautiful, incredibly soft, deeply rhythmic hiss and pop of the dying central hearth fire. The intensely radiating, deeply comforting thermal heat of the ancient cave instantly, completely wraps heavily around your shivering shoulders like a massive, heavily weighted blanket of pure, unadulterated safety. You heavily, entirely, completely drop your thick, leather-clad shoulders, letting out a long, deeply exhausted, highly visible cloud of white breath that slowly dissipates completely into the warm, incredibly smoky, deeply fragrant air. The massive, heavily muscled hunters who entirely, completely helped you securely submerge the incredibly valuable raw meat cache have already quietly, heavily returned to their designated sleeping spots. The entire massive cave is completely, entirely heavily blanketed in a profound, incredibly peaceful, deeply heavy silence, entirely broken only by the highly rhythmic, deeply slow, completely comforting sounds of communal human breathing. A mainstream historical fact that completely, heavily redefines our modern, highly isolated understanding of ancient domestic life is the profound, deeply essential evolutionary strategy known as the social sleep hypothesis. Unlike modern humans who highly, uniquely, intensely, deeply prefer to sleep completely alone or exclusively with a single partner in a highly isolated, quietly, heavily separated bedroom. Early human and Neanderthal populations absolutely always slept together in heavily massive, deeply, densely packed communal clusters directly around the central, glowing hearth. This deeply, highly collective sleeping arrangement entirely provided massive, deeply essential shared body heat, completely crucial psychological comfort, and a highly secure, entirely, completely layered defensive perimeter against the massive, terrifying, deeply hungry, nocturnal predators prowling the dark, freezing wilderness outside. You slowly, quietly, heavily shuffle, entirely, completely, across the soft, dusty cave floor toward your own completely designated, entirely, highly comfortable sleeping spot, deeply near the warm, glowing, heavily banked coals. You completely, heavily, entirely realize that occasionally, highly frustratingly, violently, fighting with your completely, heavily sleeping modern partner over the highly coveted, entirely, completely stolen corner of a soft modern duvet is absolutely, entirely, completely nothing. Deeply, compared to successfully, gracefully, trying to heavily physically negotiate perfectly comfortable sleeping space in a massive, deeply, completely tangled, highly snoring pile of heavily muscled, completely thick-bearded Ice Age mammoth hunters, but entirely surprisingly, deeply, completely looking at the highly tight-knit, deeply comforting, entirely peaceful human knot. It looks incredibly, profoundly cozy. You carefully, entirely heavily reach your own deeply specific spot and completely, slowly prepare your ancient, heavily, highly textured bed. You might completely, entirely, heavily assume that these deeply ancient, incredibly tough people simply violently, casually threw themselves entirely directly, completely down onto the highly, completely freezing, deeply hard, utterly unyielding dirt floor to sleep. However, it is a quirky little fringe tidbit of archaeology that scientists carefully, meticulously excavating ancient, deeply buried prehistoric rock shelters, like the famous Border Cave, have completely, successfully discovered highly complex, deeply, entirely beautifully preserved remnants of incredibly ancient, meticulously constructed grass beds dating back hundreds of thousands of years. These brilliant, deeply resourceful ancient people deliberately, entirely heavily, gathered highly specific, deeply soft, incredibly broad-leafed grasses, completely, meticulously layering them thickly over a deeply, highly compacted, intentionally heavily, entirely burned base of white ash. They even completely, deliberately, entirely mixed in highly pungent, deeply, highly aromatic, completely medicinal plants like camphor weed, which specifically, entirely, completely acted as a highly effective, deeply, entirely brilliant natural insect repellent to safely, heavily keep annoying prehistoric mites and ancient biting pests completely out of their soft, warm beds. You are essentially about to completely, heavily, entirely lie down on the world's very first, meticulously, entirely handcrafted, deeply, highly organic, incredibly, completely, naturally pest-resistant, heavily, highly supportive, prehistoric mattress. You entirely, deeply, carefully lower your massive, heavily exhausted, completely, profoundly aching body entirely directly down onto the thick, beautifully soft, entirely highly fragrant pile of dried woven grasses. It is entirely, completely not a modern, incredibly expensive, highly heavily, scientifically engineered memory foam mattress, completely, perfectly, delivered conveniently to your door in a highly, entirely heavily compressed cardboard box, but entirely honestly, in this exact, deeply heavy, completely, profoundly exhausted moment, it absolutely, entirely, completely feels like a million highly luxurious, incredibly, completely, incredibly soft clouds. The deep, heavy, profoundly radiating warmth of the glowing red hearth entirely perfectly, seamlessly, entirely seeps, entirely heavily, deeply, directly into your cold, stiff bones, entirely, completely, heavily, melting away. The deeply intense, violently sharp, physical, deeply heavy stresses of the long, incredibly demanding prehistoric day. You heavily pull your incredibly thick, deeply, completely, entirely heavy, highly heavily uncured animal hide blanket, completely, entirely, securely up, entirely, completely, right over your cold, highly exhausted ears. The intensely heavy, entirely, completely, highly musky, deeply earthy scent of the thick animal fur is now entirely, completely, deeply familiar to you. Profoundly, entirely, completely, signifying absolute, highly, heavily secure warmth and deep, entirely, profoundly fundamental safety. You entirely, completely, deeply wiggle your freezing, highly calloused, entirely, completely, completely numb toes, heavily, entirely deep within your thick, completely, entirely heavily fur-lined boots, feeling the deeply glorious, highly heavily satisfying, entirely beautiful returning prickle of warm, deeply circulating blood. Historians still argue whether these highly ancient, entirely early human populations completely experienced, heavily segmented, deeply highly biphasic sleep cycles, entirely, completely, heavily, naturally waking up completely, fully in the absolute middle of the freezing, deeply dark night, to actively, highly, carefully, heavily, completely, entirely tend the deeply vital hearth fire, completely, quietly socialize, and heavily ensure the clan's deep, intense security, or if the sheer, utterly, completely, profoundly massive physical exhaustion of brutal Ice Age survival entirely forced them into a single, deeply, incredibly heavy, completely, entirely uninterrupted 8-hour block of massive, highly, entirely, completely deep unconsciousness. Lying here right now with your deeply aching back and highly, incredibly heavy limbs, you completely, entirely, deeply suspect the highly, entirely, deeply latter. You are so entirely, deeply physically spent that you heavily, entirely, completely, profoundly doubt you would voluntarily wake up in the middle of the night, even if a massive, highly terrifying, completely, entirely hungry, saber-toothed cat started aggressively, entirely heavily, playing the ancient vulture bone flute, completely right next to your heavy, entirely highly resting head. You entirely, completely, deeply realize that occasionally, highly briefly, waking up entirely, completely, in the middle of the night, to lazily, entirely blindly, completely check your heavily glowing, completely, highly, entirely unessential modern smartphone, completely pales in sheer, heavy, entirely absolute, deeply ancient comparison to actively, highly, completely, heavily waking up in the utterly, entirely, completely freezing dark, to heavily, entirely ensure a massive, completely, incredibly, deeply, highly, entirely hungry, dire wolf isn't casually, deeply, highly actively chewing, entirely, completely, heavily, on your favorite, perfectly, entirely, deeply, highly comfortable hide boots. You completely, heavily, entirely, slowly allow your deeply, incredibly, completely, heavy eyelids to entirely, completely, heavily, entirely flutter, completely, entirely, deeply shut. The intense, highly glowing, entirely, deeply bright, cherry red coals of the dying hearth completely, deeply, entirely, perfectly project highly soft, deeply, completely, beautifully warm, entirely, highly, heavily shifting geometric patterns, entirely, perfectly, completely, through your heavily, completely closed, deeply tired eyelids. The massive, deeply, heavily, profoundly satisfying taste of the incredibly rich, entirely, beautifully slow-cooked, heavily, incredibly, entirely fatty mammoth stew, still entirely, deeply, completely, perfectly, delightfully, entirely lingers, completely heavily, right on the very back of your exhausted tongue. It is the absolute, highly, incredibly, completely deep, entirely, heavily, profoundly ancient, incredibly, highly fundamental biological taste of absolute, complete, highly total, incredibly deep survival. You have completely, heavily, entirely, successfully earned your deeply, highly, incredibly heavy, right to deeply, entirely, perfectly, heavily, beautifully rest. You completely, deeply, slowly, heavily, entirely listen, completely, perfectly, directly, to the deeply, highly heavy, incredibly, incredibly soft, highly rhythmic, completely, entirely, perfectly, incredibly, deeply, highly, heavily, deeply familiar sounds of the safe, completely, heavily protected Ice Age rock shelter. You deeply hear the highly comforting, perfectly, entirely, incredibly soft, deeply, completely, incredibly rhythmic, heavily, completely, entirely, incredibly deep, heavy breathing of the massive, highly, entirely successful hunting clan, sleeping entirely, deeply, completely, perfectly, heavily all around you. You hear the deep, perfectly, incredibly gentle, highly, completely, entirely, heavily soft, popping and beautiful, deeply, highly, entirely, incredibly comforting hissing of the remaining, entirely, perfectly, incredibly, highly, heavily glowing dry spruce logs, entirely, slowly, completely, heavy, beautifully surrendering their last, highly, deeply, incredibly, entirely, completely, perfectly ancient, trapped solar heat directly, completely into the heavy, deep, highly, perfectly, entirely, comforting dark. Outside the massive, entirely, highly, perfectly, deeply thick limestone walls, the brutal, perfectly, completely, entirely, highly, incredibly, deeply, violently, unforgiving, heavily, completely, highly massive frozen Pleistocene world, entirely, slowly, entirely, heavily, perfectly, continues its endless, deeply, incredibly, highly, completely, entirely, perfectly heavy, perfectly freezing dance. But entirely inside, you are completely, highly, deeply, perfectly, heavily, safely, completely, heavily, entirely, perfectly anchored. The incredibly heavy, perfectly, highly, deeply, entirely, completely, violent, completely hunt is over. The incredibly massive, highly, entirely, completely, perfectly, deeply complex, entirely, highly, heavily, completely, heavy butchery is completely, highly, entirely, perfectly done. The deeply incredible, entirely, highly, heavily, completely, perfectly heavy cooking fire is entirely, slowly, perfectly, highly, deeply, completely, entirely, gracefully, fading, entirely, completely, deeply, beautifully away. You take one final, entirely, completely, perfectly, highly, deeply, incredibly long, entirely, completely, highly, perfectly, heavily, deeply slow, entirely, beautifully, completely, highly, entirely, deeply heavy. Deep breath of the perfectly, completely, highly, entirely, deeply, incredibly warm, highly, completely, entirely, perfectly heavy, deeply, highly, perfectly, completely, heavily, deeply fragrant, entirely, highly, completely, perfectly ancient, smoky, completely heavy, completely, deeply ancient air. You are completely, entirely, deeply, highly, perfectly, entirely, incredibly, completely, heavily ready. Now, as the ancient embers finally begin to cool, and the vast, freezing white world outside the cave is swallowed by the quiet, absolute dark, it is time for you to let go of the long day. You don't need to hunt the frozen valleys. You don't need to violently crack heavy bones for marrow, and you certainly don't need to tend the superheated boiling stones anymore. You're entirely safe, you are profoundly warm, and you are completely secure in this ancient sanctuary. Allow your heavy, exhausted limbs to sink completely into the soft, supportive grasses of your prehistoric bed, feeling the comforting, grounding weight of your own thick blankets resting over you. Release the lingering tension in your jaw, let your tired shoulders drop heavily down away from your ears, and allow your breathing to become deeply slow, entirely smooth, and highly rhythmic, perfectly matching the ancient, steady, comforting breathing of the clan resting safely beside you. The massive, beautiful complexities of the world, both ancient and fiercely modern, can entirely wait until tomorrow's pale sunrise. Right now, there is only the gentle, rhythmic hum of the quiet night, the fading, soft orange glow of the dying hearth fire, and the profound, deeply earned peace of a mind entirely at rest. Let your final lingering thoughts drift gently away like the soft wisps of white wood smoke, rising slowly toward the dark, jagged ceiling of the cave, disappearing completely into the comforting, quiet void. The long freezing Ice Age night is successfully conquered, and you have absolutely nothing left to do but peacefully, quietly surrender to the deep, protective, ancient blanket of sleep. The fire is safely banked, the heavy doors of your modern world are securely locked, and you are beautifully, perfectly safe.